The realtor was still standing on my parents' porch when my mother called me screaming. The evening before, my parents had told me to sell the bungalow I'd spent 6 years, setting aside for my adopted daughter to help cover Sloane's $900,000 crisis. And my father had said my sister was my real family, while Piper was not. I had looked at my mother, my father, and my smiling sister and said, "Okay, I'll sell a house." Now the for sale packet in Mom's hand carried her own address, and that was only the first thing my family had hidden from me. Before I take you back to how that happened, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me through the end of this story, and if you enjoy spending time here with me, I'd be glad to have you subscribe and come back for the next one. Tuesday, the 18th of August 2026, began with dirt under my fingernails, a broken sprinkler head, and a customer who wanted a plant that could survive what she cheerfully described as years of neglect. At 39, I had spent enough time running a garden center to know that people often wanted nature to forgive them for forgetting it existed. I was standing beside a display of pothos and snake plants when Piper appeared at my elbow, carrying a tray of herbs she had been helping me restock before we headed home. The customer repeated that she needed something she absolutely could not kill. Piper, without changing expression, said, "Plastic is aisle 4. The woman stared at her for half a second, then laughed so loudly that the cashier across the greenhouse looked up. I rested a hand on Piper's shoulder and told the customer, "And this is why she doesn't work on commission." Piper gave me the small sideways smile she used whenever she knew she had gotten away with something. That was the rhythm of our life. Before the phone rang, soil, schedules, customers, homework, dinner plans, the ordinary complaints of a 15-year-old who believed loading bags of mulch violated several international treaties. Piper had lived with me since she was 3 and had legally become my daughter at 4. Adoption was part of her history, but it was not the organizing question of our home. She knew who her mother was. I knew who my daughter was. Most days, the rest of the world managed to understand that too. My mother's name lit up my phone while I was wiping spilled potting mix from the counter. Kathleen Caldwell did not call me during business hours unless she wanted something handled. Sometimes it was small, a repairman who had not shown up, a bill she thought looked wrong, a family appointment no one else had remembered. Sometimes it was Sloane. My younger sister had been the source of enough family emergencies over the years that I had learned to distinguish the urgency in Mom's voice from the actual urgency of the situation. That afternoon, though, she sounded different. Tight, controlled. She said I needed to come to the house as soon as I could because there was a family emergency. When I asked what had happened, she refused to explain over the phone and only repeated that Sloane was there and Dad was waiting. I looked through the glass wall of the greenhouse at Piper, who had moved on to arranging basil and rosemary near the register. The late August sun had turned the parking lot white with heat, and the irrigation mist hung in the greenhouse like a thin veil. Nothing in front of me looked urgent. My first instinct was still to rearrange the day around whatever had gone wrong for everyone else. I told my manager I was leaving a little early, checked the final delivery schedule, and closed the office computer. Piper was already supposed to ride home with me, so she came along. She asked whether Grandma's refrigerator had broken again. I said I doubted Mom would summon both daughters for an appliance. Piper shrugged and went back to scrolling through photographs she had taken of old houses around Omaha, apparently satisfied that whatever the adults were doing could wait until we arrived. The first thing I noticed at my parents' house was Sloane's SUV. It sat in the driveway angled slightly toward the curb, polished enough to catch the afternoon sun in a hard silver glare. It was the kind of luxury vehicle that announced itself before the driver ever stepped out. I had seen it often enough that I normally paid no attention, but the contrast struck me that day because I had spent the drive imagining some catastrophic family problem. Sloane's car looked like catastrophe had recently been detailed. The house behind it was a modest 3-bedroom place, with a narrow front porch and a maple that shaded half the lawn. My parents had been living there for 8 years. They called it their house, Their Christmas cards sometimes referred to it as their forever place. My father had replaced the mailbox himself and spent 2 summers arguing with the grass along the north fence. There had never been much reason for me to correct the language. A home could feel like yours, even when the deed said otherwise. And until that afternoon, I had never needed my parents to remember that I had bought the property in 2018 as a rental investment before they ever moved into it. Piper followed me inside. The dining table had already been cleared except for a legal pad, 3 glasses of water, and a stack of printed financial summaries that Sloane kept touching without actually looking at. Mom sat with both hands wrapped around one glass. Dad was at the head of the table, a position he had claimed in every dining room he had occupied for as long as I could remember. Sloane sat nearest the window in cream slacks and a blouse that probably cost more than the monthly payment on my first work truck. She looked tired, but not defeated. There was a carefulness about her makeup and hair that made me think she had known this meeting was coming long before I had. I did not ask for a dramatic explanation. I sat down, and within minutes the shape of the problem emerged through Sloane's attempt to make it sound temporary. Her interior furnishings and design business had expanded quickly over the previous 2 years. The second showroom had cost more than projected. Sales had softened. Vendor balances had accumulated. Equipment and lease obligations had piled up around 2 bank facilities. Taken together, she was carrying close to $900,000 in debt and other business exposure. The number was large enough that Piper stopped pretending not to listen. But $900,000 was not due the next morning. The immediate problem was a revolving business line of $250,000 that had reached the point where the lender was demanding a cure or repayment after defaults and covenant problems. The rest consisted of longer-term debt, vendor obligations, and lease exposure. Sloane kept describing the situation as a cash flow squeeze, as if the right injection of money would allow the whole structure to breathe again. I had run a business long enough to understand the difference between a temporary shortage and a company beginning to consume cash merely to preserve its shape. I was not an accountant, and I had no interest in pretending to be one. But I knew enough to ask the most basic question. Before anyone in the family put money into this, what was Sloane selling or closing herself? Mom's fingers tightened around her glass. Sloane had a condo. She had the SUV sitting outside. She had expensive showroom inventory, business equipment, and 2 locations. I asked whether the second showroom had been closed, whether inventory liquidation had begun, whether the condo was being listed, whether any formal restructuring had been explored. None of it had happened. Sloane had considered options, she said. She had spoken to people. She needed time. Mom cut across the discussion before I could ask what spoken to people actually meant and said there was no time for an interrogation. Dad backed her immediately. The family, he said, needed a solution rather than an autopsy. That was the first moment I understood. I had not been invited there to help think. They had already chosen the solution. They needed me to agree. The bungalow came into the conversation so smoothly that for a second, I thought I had missed a sentence. Mom referred to it as if it were an obvious line item on the same legal pad as Sloane's business debt. The small 2-bedroom property was worth around $380,000 by then. I still owed a little over $90,000 on it. After normal selling costs and paying off the mortgage, I could reasonably clear somewhere around $260,000. Dad had heard me mention the remaining balance before when we talked about my rentals, so the number was not a secret. What unsettled me was how neatly their plan matched it. Almost exactly enough to make the immediate $250,000 problem disappear. Everyone in my family called it Piper's house. Legally, it was mine. I had bought it in 2020 after my landscaping company finally reached the kind of stability that let me think beyond the next payroll cycle. It was rented out, maintained like any other property, and still carried a mortgage. But from the day I bought it, I had told Piper that it was something I was building for her future. Maybe she would live there when she was older. Maybe she would keep renting it. Maybe she would sell it one day and choose something completely different. The point had never been the physical house. The point was that she would enter adulthood with one door already open. Mom wanted me to close that door because Sloan had borrowed too much money. She did not phrase it cruelly at first. That was part of what made the request so disturbing. Mom explained that Piper was only 15 and would not need the bungalow for years. I had time to build the equity back. My business was healthy. Property values changed. Sloan, by contrast, had employees and vendors and obligations that existed now. Selling the bungalow, in Mom's telling, was not taking something from Piper. It was temporarily moving a family resource to where it was most urgently needed. Sloan stayed remarkably quiet. She did not lean across the table and beg me. She did not promise to repay every dollar. She let Mom carry the moral weight of the request while Dad sat beside her looking as if the decision should already have been made. Every few seconds, Sloan ran her thumb over the edge of one page. When I looked directly at her, she met my eyes without embarrassment. I asked again what she was giving up first. Not in theory, not someday. First. Her condo had not been listed. The second showroom was still operating. The inventory she had spent months telling everyone was premium and highly valuable had not been liquidated. The SUV outside was still outside. I knew a car did not solve a $900,000 business problem, and I was not foolish enough to imagine every asset had clean equity behind it. That was not the point. The point was the order of sacrifice. My 15-year-old daughter's future had somehow reached the top of the list before my 35-year-old sister's present lifestyle had reached the bottom. I told them no. The room changed without anyone moving very much. Mom placed her glass down with exaggerated care. Sloan finally looked away from me and toward Dad. Piper was sitting 2 chairs from mine, her hands folded in her lap now, phone face down on the table. I could hear the central air pushing through the vent, above the kitchen doorway, and the faint tick of the wall clock behind Dad. Mom tried once more to frame refusal as a misunderstanding. She said no one was asking Piper to lose anything forever. I could recover financially. Piper had years ahead of her. Sloan did not. That phrase stayed with me. Piper had years. As if more future made a person easier to rob. I asked whether the 3 adults sitting across from me were truly saying Sloan should keep her own property while Piper's was sold to save her. Mom's mouth tightened. She called the way I had phrased it cruel. Then Dad leaned forward. He had been mostly controlled until then, but refusal did something to him. His jaw hardened, and he flattened one palm on the tabletop. I had seen that gesture throughout my childhood. It meant the discussion was about to stop being a discussion. Dad had spent his adult life believing family order depended on someone being willing to end an argument. Usually he volunteered. Your sister is your real family. That adopted girl isn't. For several seconds, the house seemed to become unnaturally precise. I noticed a ring of condensation beneath Mom's water glass. I noticed one corner of Sloan's financial packet curling upward. I noticed that the clock had reached 5:17. Most of all, I noticed Piper. She became perfectly still, her chin lifted by the smallest amount, and her eyes moved from my father to me. There was hurt there, unmistakable and sharp, but not confusion. Piper knew exactly who she was. The question in her face was what I was going to do now, that someone had placed a price tag on the difference between blood and love. Then I saw Sloan smile. It was not broad enough to call triumphant. If I had blinked, I might have missed it. Just a brief softening at one corner of her mouth, followed by the familiar calm of someone who believed the difficult part was over. That tiny expression hurt almost as much as Dad's sentence. Sloan knew my role in the family. They all did. Marin would be angry. Marin would object. Marin would point out what was unfair. And then Marin would calculate the least damaging way to fix the problem because Marin was sensible and strong, and financially stable and could handle it. I had been praised for those qualities so often that none of us had spent much time asking what they cost. I looked at Sloan's clothes, at Mom's careful hands, at Dad's palm still planted on the table. Then I looked at Piper. "Okay," I said. "I'll sell a house." The tension left Sloane's shoulders almost immediately. Mom exhaled and reached toward the papers. Dad leaned back. That was all the confirmation I needed that they believed I had surrendered. I stood, picked up my bag, and touched Piper lightly between the shoulder blades. We left before anyone could turn my sentence into a family reconciliation. The late afternoon heat struck us as soon as we stepped outside. The inside of my car had been baking in the sun, and the steering wheel was almost too hot to touch. I started the engine and turned the air conditioning up, while Piper fastened her seatbelt. For the first few blocks, she watched Omaha pass through the passenger window. Lawns gone pale at the edges from August heat, a man dragging a trash bin up his driveway, 2 children running through a sprinkler. Eventually, she asked why being adopted made Grandpa think her future was worth less. That was the wound Dad had created, not doubt about belonging with me, but the knowledge that someone she loved had valued her future differently. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. There are questions a mother wants to answer with wisdom. There are others where wisdom would only disguise the ugliness. I told her I did not have an answer that would make what he said acceptable. I told her only that nothing he said changed what belonged between her and me. She turned back to the window. That was enough for the drive home, but it was not enough for me. After dinner, Piper went upstairs with her sketchbook. I sat alone at my kitchen table with my laptop open and the overhead light throwing a pale circle across the wood. I did not open the bungalow records. I opened the file for the house my parents lived in. I had bought it 8 years earlier as a straightforward rental investment. My parents had sold their previous home while downsizing and needed somewhere temporary while they decided where they wanted to settle. I had an empty property. 6 months had seemed harmless. 6 months became 8 years. They signed a month-to-month rental agreement and paid rent well below market, plus utilities. I had never minded. They were my parents. The mortgage got paid, they cared for the place, and I had never felt the need to remind them whose name appeared on the deed, until that night. I sat staring at the property file while Dad's sentence replayed in my head. Not because I needed to hear it again, but because each time it returned, another piece of the afternoon shifted around it. They had been willing to volunteer Piper's security because, in their hierarchy, her loss was recoverable. Sloane's was not. I knew enough about myself to recognize anger when it was making decisions for me. I also knew enough to recognize a boundary I had postponed for years. The two were tangled together that night, and I did not pretend otherwise. I called Dana Ruiz, a realtor I had worked with before, and asked her to prepare a market listing consultation for the rental. We discussed the basic sequence briefly. That night, I sent the written notice ending the month-to-month tenancy, while voluntarily giving my parents roughly 90 days to transition, and I authorized Dana to begin the listing work. Future photography, access, and showings would be coordinated properly. Anger had put the file in front of me, but it was not going to put my parents' belongings on a sidewalk. But they were going to find out that the house they had gradually learned to call theirs was not an asset they controlled any more than Piper's bungalow was. When I finally closed the laptop, it was after midnight. I slept badly. At a little after 8 the next morning, Dana arrived at my parents' front door with the preliminary seller packet, listing documents and paperwork, explaining how future access would be coordinated with the occupants. She had no reason to know she was walking into the middle of a family war. As far as she was concerned, an owner had hired her to sell a rental property with tenants who needed notice and coordination. Mom opened the door. I did not see her face when she looked down at the paperwork. I know only what happened next because my phone began vibrating across my desk at the garden center while I was reviewing an irrigation invoice. When I answered, there was no greeting. Mom's voice came through so loudly that I had to pull the phone away from my ear. The words overlapped each other, Dana. Sale, paperwork, address, betrayal, until the only thing clear was that she had seen the for sale heading and recognized the address underneath it. I let her finish. Then Dad took the phone. His anger was easier to understand because it came in a lower register. He said I could not sell their house. I looked through my office window at rows of green plants glowing beneath the greenhouse roof. Piper was at school by then. Less than a day had passed since Dad had explained which members of our family counted as real. I reminded him, calmly, that the house had been my rental property before he and Mom ever moved into it. There was a pause. I expected another lecture about loyalty. I expected him to accuse me of revenge, selfishness, disrespect, or all three. What came instead was something I had not heard in his voice the night before. Fear. You don't understand what happens if you do this now, he said. The authority had drained out of him. If you sell this house right now, everything falls apart. My hand stopped on the invoice in front of me. Until that moment, I had believed the $900,000 crisis belonged to Sloan. The way my father said everything told me I was wrong. My father's fear stayed with me long after the call ended. If he had shouted, I would have known what to do with it. Dad had spent most of my life treating anger as a form of punctuation. When he believed a conversation had gone on too long, his voice became firmer, his sentences shorter, and eventually everyone understood that continuing to disagree would be interpreted as disrespect. I knew that version of him well enough to stop hearing the volume and listen for the meaning underneath. But the man who had said everything falls apart did not sound like a father furious that his daughter had listed a rental property. He sounded like someone watching a fuse burn toward something he had already hidden. I remained at my desk after the call, one hand resting on the irrigation invoice I had stopped reading. Outside the office window, a forklift moved slowly between pallets of stone edging, its warning beep repeating every few seconds. Someone dragged a hose across the concrete floor of the greenhouse. The normal sounds of my business continued with irritating confidence, as if the rest of the world had not received notice that the Caldwell family was apparently approaching financial extinction. Mom called twice more before 9. I let both calls go to voicemail while I finished the invoice and signed a delivery approval. It was not punishment. I simply knew what would happen if I answered before I could separate facts from adrenaline. For most of my adult life, family urgency had been enough to push everything else off my desk. That morning, I wanted at least one ordinary task to remain where I had put it. By the time I listened to Mom's messages, her outrage had become more organized. She accused me of humiliating her and Dad by sending a realtor to their home without warning them first. She said neighbors had seen Dana on the porch. She said Dad had barely slept after our argument, and that my response was wildly disproportionate to something said in anger. She never repeated what he had said, even in a voicemail. She edited the injury down to something said in anger, as though the problem had been volume rather than content. I called her back near 10. I did not debate whether Dad had meant his words. I told her the practical truth instead. No one was being removed from the house that day, that week, or even that month. I had prepared written notice, ending the month-to-month arrangement, but I was voluntarily giving them roughly 90 days to relocate. Dana would coordinate any future photography, access, or showings properly. There would be no strangers walking through the house without notice, no boxes on the sidewalk, no sheriff at the door. The sale would proceed like the sale of an occupied rental property because that was what it was. Mom heard only the word sale. She said I was talking about her home as though it were a spreadsheet entry. That accusation almost made me laugh, though there was nothing funny in it. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had discussed Piper's bungalow exactly that way. The difference was that when Piper's future appeared on a spreadsheet, Mom called it family responsibility. When the same logic touched the roof over her own head, it became cruelty. Dad came onto the call before the conversation could circle back through the same accusations. He was calmer than he had been that morning, but the calm had effort behind it. He wanted me to suspend everything until Sloane's situation was resolved. He did not ask me to abandon the sale forever. He wanted a pause. 30 days, 60, whatever it took to get through the immediate crisis. The phrase caught my attention because it made the house sound less like their home and more like something they needed kept available. I asked what selling my rental had to do with Sloane's business. Dad said the family could not afford more instability right now. He spoke generally about pressure, timing, and the consequences of making emotional decisions when everyone was already under strain. Nothing he said actually answered the question. That was when I began to understand that the house itself was not what frightened him. It was the timing. I did not press him further on the phone. Dad was already retreating into the tone he used when he wanted authority to replace explanation. I ended the conversation by repeating that they had 90 days and that Dana would handle the process professionally. By the time I put my phone down, my coffee had gone cold. The written notice had already gone out the night before. The 90-day transition remained unchanged. Sending it did not feel like victory. That surprised me. The night before, opening the rental file had produced a sharp, almost clean sensation, as if I had finally found a lever in a room where everyone assumed I had none. By morning, the action had weight. My parents would have to move. Rooms they had treated as permanent would become somebody else's. Mom would pack the dishes she had arranged in my kitchen cabinets 8 years earlier. Dad would have to decide what to do with the workbench he had built in the garage. None of that changed what they had done to Piper. It simply made consequence more complicated than revenge fantasies usually allowed. Piper got home from school shortly after 4. She dropped her backpack beside the kitchen island and went straight to the refrigerator, which was how I knew she had survived the first full day of sophomore year classes without catastrophe. She was hungry enough to consider leftover pasta acceptable, and that ranked above most emotional conversations at 15. I waited until she had food in front of her, before telling her that Grandma and Grandpa knew I had listed the rental, and that they would have 90 days to move if the sale proceeded. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. For a moment, something close to satisfaction crossed her face. It vanished quickly. She asked whether I had really meant to sell it or whether I had only wanted to scare them. I told her I had meant it. She looked down at her plate, turning the fork once through the pasta without eating. Piper had inherited none of my features, obviously, but she had somehow acquired my habit of needing to organize a thought before speaking it. When she finally looked up, she said she was glad I had not sold the bungalow. Then she told me something I had not expected. "I don't want their house, Mom. I just don't want them deciding mine is worth less." The sentence was simple enough to belong to a 15-year-old, and precise enough to leave nowhere for me to hide. I had spent the previous night bundling 2 decisions together because anger made them feel identical: protecting Piper's bungalow and ending my parents' housing arrangement. Sitting across from her in the late sunlight, I told her I understood. I could reconsider the rental on its own merits, but I would not tell people I was putting her grandparents out for Piper. She nodded once and returned to eating. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. It changed far more than some of the hour-long arguments my family had been having. That evening, after Piper went upstairs to work on a photography assignment, I opened a notebook at the kitchen table and wrote one number at the top of a blank page: $900,000. Below it I wrote, $250,000 immediate line. Then I stopped. I had no complete debt structure. I had Sloane's description from the previous afternoon, a stack of phrases about liquidity and timing, and a suspiciously precise interest in selling an asset that could produce approximately the amount required to deal with the immediate line. That was not enough information for anyone to make a rational investment, much less enough reason to erase 6 years of planning for Piper. So I changed the question. Instead of asking whether I should help Sloane, I asked what information I would require before I even considered help. The answer was embarrassingly ordinary: everything. I called Sloane the next morning and told her that if she expected $1 from me, the full financial picture had to go in front of an independent turnaround professional, not her regular bookkeeper, not one of Dad's friends. Not somebody who would begin with the assumption that the family had a spare $250,000 asset sitting in Piper's name. I would pay for one limited consultation myself. That was the only financial commitment I was willing to make. Sloane treated the condition as an insult. Through several minutes of explanation that I mostly let pass without interrupting, she argued that I already knew the scale of the problem, that outside professionals would waste time telling her things she knew, and that exposing every weak point of the business to a stranger would make an already stressful situation worse. I listened until she finished. "A number is not a plan," I said. I did not add anything else. The silence that followed told me more than another argument would have. Eventually, she agreed to provide enough information for an initial review, though even her agreement came wrapped in the suggestion that I was forcing unnecessary procedure onto a family emergency. I did not correct the word family. I was beginning to suspect it had been doing too much work in our conversations. Over the next day, without getting anywhere near a full accounting, Sloane admitted enough for the $900,000 figure to lose some of its theatrical power. It was not one giant note waiting to be paid. Around $420,000 was term debt tied to expansion. The immediate danger remained the $250,000 revolving line that had run into default and covenant trouble. The rest was lease, vendor, equipment, and other operating exposure spread over time. Selling Piper's bungalow could deal with the immediate line, but it could not make $900,000 disappear. All three of them had spoken the previous afternoon, as though it were a solution when, at best, it bought time. Every time Sloane explained what the cash would accomplish, she returned to some version of the same idea. If enough money went into the business now, she could stabilize the flagship location, protect vendor relationships, preserve client confidence, and negotiate the rest from a stronger position. What I did not hear was any serious discussion of shrinking. She still talked about saving the flagship showroom as though its survival were non-negotiable. The second location had not yet been closed. Inventory had not been liquidated. Her lifestyle still seemed to occupy a protected category separate from the resources everyone else was expected to contribute. I wrote down what I understood and what I did not. By the time Piper wandered into the kitchen that evening, I had numbers covering half a sheet of paper and arrows connecting things that were still assumptions rather than facts. She leaned against the island long enough to inspect the page. "I knew adulthood had math," she said. "I didn't know it had this much math. That's why nobody puts it in the brochure." The corner of her mouth lifted. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it loosened something in the room. We were allowed to be people who found ridiculous things ridiculous, even while the family was falling apart around us. Piper took an apple from the bowl, reminded me that staring harder at the numbers probably would not make them confess, and went upstairs. She was right. The numbers were not the part trying hardest to hide. The people were. Mom proved that the next afternoon. She came to the garden center alone, and waited until I had finished speaking with a contractor near the outdoor stone displays. She had chosen the location carefully, whether consciously or not. At work, I was less likely to raise my voice or walk away. She knew that about me. I led her into my office but left the door partly open. Mom did not waste time on the house at first. She spoke about Sloane's business, the employees who depended on it, and the damage a public collapse could cause. She reminded me that businesses sometimes went through rough periods and recovered. None of that was untrue. What made the argument dangerous was the moral arithmetic she built around it. Piper was young. That became the center of everything. Piper had time to recover from losing the bungalow. I had time to rebuild the equity. Sloane, on the other hand, could lose years of work immediately. A teenager would not need a house soon. A failing business needed money now. Mom made youth sound like financial insulation. I listened until she finished and then asked why Piper, having more years ahead of her, made her future easier to spend. Mom's expression tightened. She said I was deliberately turning a family sacrifice into an attack on Piper. I told her I was only following the order they had chosen. The first asset they wanted liquidated did not belong to the 35-year-old who had created the debt. It was the asset I had spent 6 years building for the 15-year-old who had created none of it. For a moment, Mom had no response. Then she returned to the familiar language of family, helping family. It was not an answer. It was the absence of one. She left without changing my mind. The conversation stayed with me because it revealed something I had not fully understood at the dining table. Mom genuinely believed fairness could be measured by how much pain a person could survive. I was stable, so I could give more. Piper was young, so she could recover. Sloane was already in trouble, so protecting her from further loss became the priority. The strongest person did not receive protection in my family. The strongest person received the bill. That evening, Dad called again. He was less interested in moral arguments than Mom had been. He wanted to know whether I had canceled Dana's work. When I told him I had not, he began describing the pressure Sloane was under and the damage that could follow if the revolving line went into full enforcement. Then he said something that made every other word disappear. He said I had no idea what we stood to lose if the bank called the line. I stood at my bedroom window with the phone against my ear, looking down at the backyard where the sprinkler rotated across a strip of grass. Dad kept speaking for another few seconds before he seemed to hear his own pronoun. He tried to smooth over it. He said he meant the family generally. Everyone stood to lose if Sloane's business collapsed. Jobs, reputation, relationships, the usual broad collection of consequences. But Sloane came onto the call almost immediately after that, redirecting the conversation toward the consultation I had demanded and asking how soon I intended to arrange it. The change was too fast, too coordinated. I stopped listening to the content and paid attention to the shape. Dad had said we. Sloane had moved the conversation away from it. My mother had spent 2 days insisting Piper's bungalow needed to cover an immediate $250,000 line. And that morning, when the realtor arrived at the house, Dad had not sounded offended. He had sounded afraid. After we ended the call, I sat on the edge of my bed with the room dark around me and went back through every sentence I could remember from the family meeting. Dad had been unusually focused on solving the immediate line. Mom had behaved as though the bungalow was not merely helpful but necessary. Neither had reacted to the $900,000 total with the confusion I would have expected from parents hearing the full scale of their daughter's debt for the first time. They had known more than I had. The next morning, I asked Dad to meet me without Mom or Sloane. He resisted. I did not. I told him I would not discuss the bungalow, pause the sale, or consider financial help until he explained what he had meant by we. He tried to return to the broader family consequences. I waited him out. Dad had always been comfortable with other people's silence when he controlled it. He was less comfortable when the silence belonged to me. Eventually his shoulders sank. He admitted he had signed a personal guarantee connected to Sloane's revolving business line. The words landed quietly. The admission was quiet. My father sat across from me with his hands clasped between his knees and acknowledged that his financial connection to Sloane's crisis was not emotional at all. It was contractual. He insisted the guarantee had been temporary in spirit, something intended to help Sloane through expansion until the business strengthened. He said the exposure was manageable if everyone did his or her part. The phrase irritated me immediately, because there had never been an agreement about what my part was. I asked whether Mom knew he had signed it. Dad did not answer at first. He looked toward the window. That was enough. Mom knew. The two people who had presented themselves as worried parents helping one struggling daughter had their own money tied to the same line they wanted me to pay off with Piper's bungalow. Suddenly, the urgency made more sense. But not all of it. I asked Dad exactly what he had guaranteed. He rubbed one thumb over the side of his hand, a small repetitive movement I had never seen him make when he felt in control. Then he said the guarantee was only part of it. I waited. He looked at me for a long moment, before shaking his head. "He would tell me the rest," he said, after I agreed to stop the sale. And that was when I understood that my parents were still trying to bargain with information they should have given me before they ever asked for Piper's house. My father's refusal to tell me the rest did something his confession had not. The guarantee itself was bad enough. Knowing he had signed his name behind Sloane's revolving line explained part of the panic I had heard when Dana arrived at the house. But sitting across from him while he treated the remaining information like leverage made the problem feel larger than one foolish financial decision. He was not embarrassed enough to become honest. He was frightened enough to bargain. I left without agreeing to pause the sale. For the rest of that day, the phrase "only part of it" stayed in the back of my mind while I worked. I approved a plant delivery, reviewed payroll changes for 2 seasonal crews, and walked the perimeter of a landscaping job where a retaining wall had been poured slightly off the marked line. Normally, practical problems calmed me. A wrong wall had dimensions. A vendor delay had a phone number. An invoice either matched a purchase order or it did not. Family problems were rarely that polite. By late afternoon, Dad had apparently told Mom about our meeting because she called and asked whether we could discuss things again without turning every conversation into a standoff. I did not point out that Dad was the one withholding information unless I stopped selling property I owned. I simply told her that if she and Dad expected me to consider any financial involvement in Sloane's business, there could be no more partial truths. That finally moved something. The following evening, Mom and Dad came to my house without Sloane. Piper was upstairs working on an assignment, and I kept the conversation at the kitchen table rather than moving it somewhere that might make it feel ceremonial. I had already learned what happened when my family gathered around a dining table and called an assumption a decision. Dad began by restating what he had already admitted. He and Mom had guaranteed Sloane's $250,000 revolving line. He still described the guarantee as something that had made sense at the time. Sloane had been expanding. The business had several strong years behind it, and the bank wanted additional comfort while the second location got established. Dad had spent decades in regional sales. He understood contracts well enough to know that a signature mattered. That was precisely why his repeated insistence that he had believed the risk was temporary did not comfort me. Mom added that they had also put some of their own non-retirement money behind Sloane before the current crisis. She did not give me the full amount, only admitted that there had already been an earlier cash infusion when the expansion ran short. At the time, she said, they believed the business would recover quickly and replace it. I asked why neither of them had told me. Mom rubbed one thumb along the rim of her mug. Dad looked toward the dark kitchen window, as if there might be a more agreeable version of the conversation reflected back at him. Eventually, Mom said they had not considered it necessary. They had expected Sloane's growth to resume. The second showroom was supposed to strengthen the business, not weaken it. Telling me then, in her view, would only have caused worry over a problem that might have resolved itself. That explanation would have been easier to accept if they had not eventually decided that the solution belonged to me. I asked Dad what he meant when he told me the family had enough assets if the worst happened. He answered too quickly at first, using the word family the way Mom did, large enough to include everyone's resources, and vague enough to avoid naming whose resources he had actually counted. So I asked him to be specific. That was when I heard my own properties listed before I heard anything belonging to him. The rental where he and Mom lived, Piper's bungalow. Only after those did he mention their own savings. He did not seem to notice the order until I stopped writing. I had opened a notebook because I wanted to keep the numbers straight. My pen was resting on the page when the meaning caught up with me. Dad had mentally inventoried my assets the same way I inventoried equipment at the garden center: truck, loader, greenhouse stock, irrigation tools, not because he believed he owned them, because he believed they would be available if the family needed them badly enough. The realization came quietly as I looked around my kitchen. The house I paid for, the table where Piper did homework, the business files stacked beside my laptop, the keys to 2 rental properties in the drawer behind me. Everything I had spent years building had somehow acquired an invisible second purpose. To me, Those things represented work, risk, payrolls survived, loans paid down, and a future I was trying to give my daughter. To my parents, at least some part of them had become an emergency reserve they could count before asking. Dad saw my expression change and insisted he was not claiming ownership of anything. He said he only meant that when one family member was in serious trouble, the people in better positions helped. That sentence took me somewhere I had not expected to go. I was 16 again, standing in our old hallway with a folded summer program acceptance letter in my hand. Sloane had been 12. She had gotten herself into trouble at school after convincing another girl to help her take supplies from an art room for a project they were not allowed to remove. It was not a life-changing offense, but the timing had collided with a family mess of meetings, transportation problems, and Mom's work schedule. I had been scheduled to leave for a 2-week horticulture program at a community college outside Omaha. Nothing glamorous, but I had earned the spot and saved most of the fee myself through weekend work. I remembered Mom standing beside the coat closet, explaining that the family needed things to be simpler for a few weeks. Sloane needed rides to meetings with the school. Dad was traveling. Mom could not miss work. Technically, I still could have gone. No one forbade me. Instead, they praised me into giving it up. I was the mature one. I understood how difficult things were. There would be other programs. Sloane needed the family right now. The strange thing was that I had not even been angry then. I had felt proud. At 16, being called mature by adults sounded like proof that you were becoming one of them. I had canceled the program and spent 2 weeks helping reorganize a household problem I had not caused. Years later, I barely remembered the details of what Sloane had done. I remembered the praise. That was the part that survived. Sitting at my kitchen table at 39, I could finally see what had been hidden inside that praise. My parents had never needed to say your plans matter less. They only needed to say you can handle losing them better. They had loved and supported me in many ways, but they had also built a habit around my reliability, and I had helped them build it because being useful often felt easier than being difficult. Now the price was no longer a 2-week program. It was Piper's future. Before Mom and Dad left, I repeated the only condition under which I would even discuss money for Sloane: complete enough financial disclosure for an independent professional to evaluate whether a family cash injection made sense. Dad disliked the idea. Mom said Sloane would see it as a lack of trust. I told them trust was not a financial plan. I did not need another argument after that. 2 days later, Sloane finally agreed to meet Tobias Reed. I knew Tobias professionally, but not personally. He was a turnaround CPA in his early 50s, who had worked with a landscaping supplier I knew after that company expanded too quickly and nearly buried itself under equipment payments. He was not a miracle worker. That was one reason I trusted him. The supplier had survived, but only after closing one branch, selling equipment, and accepting that saving the company did not mean preserving every piece of the company exactly as it had existed before trouble. I paid for a limited consultation. That point mattered to me. I was not hiring Tobias to run Sloane's business, investigate her, or prove she was wrong. I wanted an independent adult with no family history to look at enough numbers to tell us whether selling Piper's bungalow was actually the only rational path. We met in a conference room at Tobias's office the following week. Sloane arrived with printed summaries, a laptop, and the posture of someone prepared to defend herself rather than be advised. Dad and Mom came too. Piper did not. There was nothing a 15-year-old needed to contribute to a business distress meeting simply because adults had tried to attach her property to it. Tobias spent most of the session listening. That alone changed the atmosphere. My family tended to respond to uncomfortable facts by attaching moral meaning to them. A missed payment became a test of loyalty. A refusal became selfishness. An asset became something the family should be willing to sacrifice. Tobias treated numbers as numbers. He did not care who was older, adopted, successful, embarrassed, or disappointed. The picture he built was not comforting, but it was clearer. Sloane's business was in genuine distress. That distinction mattered because I did not want the story to become convenient. Sloane had not invented the debt. She had not created a fake emergency because she wanted Piper's bungalow. The expansion had gone badly. The second location had added overhead at exactly the wrong time. Vendor balances had risen. The revolving line was under immediate pressure. Cash flow had narrowed enough that one bad month could trigger several consequences at once. Tobias did not tell us that everything was fine. He told us that selling Piper's bungalow was not the same thing as solving the business. He summarized the available paths without turning the meeting into a finance lecture. Sloane could close the second location. She could liquidate a meaningful amount of premium inventory rather than protecting pricing. She could negotiate lease exits or surrender space. She could restructure some obligations. She could begin an orderly contraction before creditors made every choice for her. None of those options were painless, and none guaranteed survival, but options existed. That was the point. $250,000 from my property might cure the most dangerous immediate line and buy time. It would not repair a business that continued spending, as though the expansion still deserved to be preserved at all costs. Tobias also refused to give the family what I suspected Mom and Dad wanted: professional approval for a bailout based on incomplete records. He explained that he could not responsibly recommend new family money without full books, current lender terms, and a clearer view of Sloane's actual assets and obligations. He did not accuse her of hiding anything. He simply would not certify optimism. Sloane absorbed that badly. Not loudly. That would have been easier. Instead, she became increasingly precise about why each form of contraction would damage something important. Closing the second location could undermine confidence among clients who had recently been told the business was growing. Liquidating high-end inventory at discount prices could train customers to wait for markdowns and scare vendors. Giving up the flagship showroom would damage the brand she had spent years building. Her condo was more personal. When I asked whether she had even considered listing it, she said moving into something visibly cheaper while asking clients to trust her with expensive homes would create the wrong impression. Her life and business, she argued, were not as separate as mine. Clients bought taste, confidence, and success. If she began looking like someone in financial trouble, the business could collapse faster. That was the first time I understood why Sloane's arguments had worked so well on our parents. There was enough truth inside them. Image did matter in her industry. Client confidence mattered. Vendor relationships mattered. A desperate liquidation could cause secondary damage. She was not wrong about every consequence. The problem was what happened when every consequence became a reason she should lose nothing. By the end, Sloane had a strategic reason to protect almost everything attached to her own life: the condo, the flagship showroom, the premium inventory, even the timing of the second location's closure. Piper's bungalow was apparently the one exception. Tobias ended the consultation without endorsing a family cash infusion. He said there were potential restructuring or contraction paths worth exploring, but only if Sloane accepted that preserving the exact business she had built might no longer be possible. I watched Sloane close her laptop. The movement was careful, controlled, but the force she used to press the lid flat was harder than necessary. The meeting had not humiliated her. It had done something worse. It had refused to confirm the story she needed. Outside, Mom immediately began softening Tobias's conclusion. He had not said the business could not be saved. He had said options existed. Dad focused on the fact that curing the revolving line would still create breathing room. Sloane spoke about time as if it were the only missing resource. I listened without trying to win the argument. The important fact was already there. Piper's bungalow was not the only possible sacrifice. It was simply the sacrifice they preferred. That evening, I told Piper only what she needed to know. I did not give her the debt schedule. I did not explain lender covenants or lease exposure. I told her that Grandma and Grandpa had signed financial support behind part of Sloane's business debt and that an independent professional believed Sloane still had other options besides selling the bungalow. Piper was sitting cross-legged on the floor of her room, sorting through photographs for a school project. Several pictures of older Omaha houses were spread across the carpet around her porches. Narrow windows, worn brick, one crooked blue door. She had photographed twice because she liked the shape of the transom above it. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked why the adults had not started by listing everything they owned before they listed her future. There was no speech after it. She returned to arranging her photographs. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the back of her head and the pictures spread around her knees. The question did not need adult language. It did not need a lesson about finance or fairness. It was simply the question everyone else had worked so hard not to ask. My parents had spent days explaining why Piper could afford to lose. Sloane had spent days explaining why she could not. That difference was becoming more important to me than the debt itself. A few nights later, Sloane came to the garden center shortly before closing. Most of the customers were gone. One of my employees was watering the hanging baskets near the greenhouse doors, and the last sunlight had turned the west-facing glass orange. Sloane waited until I finished signing off on a landscape material order before asking to speak privately. She did not apologize for Dad's words. She did not mention Piper's face at the dining table. She wanted to talk about Tobias. Sloane said that if I forced her into a formal contraction or restructuring, the consequences would spread further than I understood. She spoke quietly this time. No audience. No mom translating her fear into duty. No dad telling me what family required. She said closing locations and exposing the full weakness of the business would not hurt only her, it would hurt Mom and Dad. I reminded her that I already knew about the guarantee. She looked at me for a second too long. Then she said I still did not understand. According to Sloane, selling the bungalow could make the immediate problem disappear before the situation widened. The revolving line could be cured. Pressure could ease. She could negotiate from a stronger position. Mom and Dad would be protected from whatever damage they had tied themselves to. I asked what damage she meant. She looked past me toward the greenhouse, where water from the hanging baskets was tapping steadily onto the concrete floor. For once, she did not try to persuade me with another explanation. She simply refused to answer. That silence confirmed what Dad's had. There was another layer. I told her I was not selling the bungalow. Sloane's face changed then, not dramatically, but enough that the practiced confidence fell away. If you make me open everything, she said, you're going to find out Mom and Dad bet more on me than they ever told you. Sloane's warning did not make me cancel anything. If anything, it made the sale feel more necessary. Over the next several days, Dana moved the rental from an angry decision on my laptop into an ordinary sale process with measurements, photographs, forms, and dates. My parents had noticed before access was needed, and still had the transition period I had promised. Ending the arrangement did not require humiliating them, even if anger had helped me start it. The first time Dana needed to photograph the exterior and confirm some measurements, Mom called to tell me the process was becoming real. She said it as though reality itself were something I had inflicted on her. Dad was more controlled, but his irritation had shifted. He no longer argued that I lacked the right to sell. Instead, he accused me of treating him and Mom like ordinary tenants. I stood in the garden center office, listening to him while one of my crews loaded pavers into a truck outside. The accusation sat strangely against the facts. They were tenants. They were also my parents. Both things had been true for 8 years. The problem was not that I had suddenly reduced them to paperwork. The problem was that the paperwork had existed the entire time, quietly underneath the family story everyone preferred. They had become comfortable enough in the house to forget where their rights ended. I had become comfortable enough with helping them to let the forgetting continue. Now the legal reality had stopped cooperating with the emotional one. Dad hated that more than he hated the listing itself. I reminded him that the 90-day transition had not changed. Dana would coordinate every access point properly, and they would have time to find something they could afford. I did not tell him this should make him grateful. That would have turned decency into a weapon. When the call ended, I stared for a while at the row of keys hanging beside my office door. Each had a plastic tag for a truck, storage shed, or rental property. The key to my parents' house was there too. It had always been just another item I was responsible for. I wondered when responsibility had become permission for everyone else. That question followed me home. So did a more uncomfortable one. Piper's sentence from the kitchen, "I don't want their house," had been working on me for days. I had begun the sale in anger. There was no respectable way to rewrite that. Dad had reduced my daughter to that adopted girl, Sloan had smiled, and I had wanted them to experience one clean, immediate consequence they could not talk their way around. The house was mine, and for one night the fact had felt almost elegant. But anger could explain why I had opened the property file. It could not, by itself, justify everything that came after. One evening, after Piper had gone upstairs, I stood at the sink rinsing 2 plates and asked myself a question I had been avoiding. If Dad had never said those words, would I still be selling the house? The water ran over my hands long enough to turn lukewarm. I could not answer yes, not honestly. That unsettled me more than if the answer had been no, because the truth was somewhere in between. The housing arrangement had become unhealthy in ways I had tolerated for years. My parents spoke about the property as though it belonged to them. They paid far below market. They had begun counting not only that house, but my other property, as part of the family's emergency reserve. Those facts existed before Dad's insult, but I had not acted on them before Dad's insult. I dried my hands and left the plate rack half full. I was beginning to understand that the sale could become a legitimate boundary, even if anger had been the first emotion pushing me toward it. The harder work was deciding why I would continue. Sloan gave me little time to sit with that distinction. Tobias had provided enough clarity during the first consultation to make contraction seem like the least destructive path, but Sloan heard the same information and reached the opposite conclusion. She began looking for another infusion of cash. I learned this because she called twice during the following week and sent a summary of what she believed could happen if she stabilized the revolving line. She was still presenting the flagship showroom as something that had to survive. Closing the second location too quickly, she argued, would frighten vendors and create the appearance of collapse. Discounting inventory would hurt the brand. Cutting staff too deeply would make it difficult to recover if sales improved. None of those arguments were entirely absurd. That made them more dangerous. Sloan had built a real business. She understood her clients. She understood how perception affected luxury spending. She knew exactly which consequences sounded frightening enough to make further borrowing feel reasonable. Tobias, in the brief follow-up he provided, remained much less emotional. He explained that there was a difference between preserving enterprise value and preserving pride. An orderly contraction might still protect the strongest part of the business, but only if Sloan accepted that some losses had to become visible. Sloan hated that word without anyone saying it aloud. Visible. She could tolerate debt better than she could tolerate looking like someone who had debt. She called Tobias's contraction plan a funeral plan in a message to me after he repeated that the second location needed to be evaluated for closure and that family cash should not enter the picture without complete information. I read the message twice, then set my phone down. The phrase told me exactly where she was. To Sloan, downsizing the business was not a strategy. It was an obituary. She would rather keep borrowing oxygen than let anyone see the building was already on fire. That afternoon, while I was supervising a delivery of ornamental trees behind the garden center, my mother contacted Piper. I did not know it was happening. That fact bothered me later, almost as much as what she said. Piper was home from school before I was. She had been working at the kitchen table when Mom called. There was nothing unusual in a grandmother contacting her granddaughter. Mom had done it for birthdays, school events, recipes, and the occasional question about whether Piper wanted to come over for dinner. Piper had never needed permission to answer. That ordinary history was what allowed Mom to step around me without making the call look like a confrontation. She did not threaten Piper. She did not raise her voice. She did something more familiar. She explained. By the time I came home, the kitchen lights were on even though there was still daylight outside. Piper was sitting at the island with a glass of water she had barely touched. Her backpack was still on the floor instead of upstairs, which was the first sign that something had interrupted her usual rhythm. She waited until I set down my bag. Then she told me Grandma had called. I could see from her face that this was not about dinner. Piper described the conversation carefully, as if she were trying to reproduce the shape of it without making it worse. Mom had told her that she was old enough to understand that sometimes families had to give things up for each other. She had said the bungalow was not being taken away forever, because Piper did not live there, and would not need it anytime soon. Marin Mom had used my name, instead of your mother could always buy another property later. Then she had asked Piper to tell me that she did not need the bungalow, not command. Tell. That distinction was how Mom would have defended it. Piper's fingers tightened around the water glass. Grandma didn't ask what I wanted, she said. She asked me to make you easier to control. The sentence came out flatter than I expected. That made it land harder. I sat across from her. There was no crying, no speech about betrayal. Piper looked angry in the specific way teenagers often do when an adult has tried to dress manipulation in reasonable language. Her jaw was tight. One foot kept tapping lightly against the cabinet beneath the island. I asked whether Mom had said anything else. Piper hesitated. That hesitation changed the room. She said Grandma had tried to explain why the money mattered so much. According to Mom, Sloane's default could cost Grandpa more than I understood. Piper did not know the financial terms. She only remembered one phrase clearly, because it had sounded serious. Grandpa's investment account could be taken. I stopped moving. Until that moment, Dad had admitted a guarantee, and an earlier investment of some family money. He had refused to tell me what only part of it meant. Sloane had warned that Mom and Dad had bet more on her than I knew. Now my mother had accidentally handed the next piece to a 15-year-old because she wanted that 15-year-old to pressure me. The ugliness of that choice reached me before the number did. Piper should not have known any of this. Not because I wanted to hide family reality from her forever, but because no adult should have been recruiting her into a dispute over her own future. She was being asked to understand Grandpa's investment risk so she would feel guilty about keeping a house she did not ask anyone to jeopardize. I told her that from then on she did not have to discuss money, property, or Sloane's business with Grandma or Grandpa unless she wanted me present. I did not tell her to block them. I did not demand that she stop loving them. I simply removed the assumption that adults could use private access to negotiate with a child. Piper nodded. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. If Grandpa's investment account was at risk, why had no one told me? I did not have an answer that belonged to her. I told her I intended to find out. Within an hour, I had asked Mom and Dad to come over. They arrived together. The atmosphere was different from the first family meeting. There were no printed packets on my table. No Sloane. No one pretending this was a collective discussion about helping a struggling business. I told them what Piper had repeated. Mom's face changed immediately. Not guilt first. Alarm. She asked whether Piper had misunderstood the conversation. I knew that instinct well. If the fact was uncomfortable, perhaps the messenger had interpreted it incorrectly. I told Mom not to make Piper responsible for translating adult information perfectly. Then I asked one question. What investment account? Dad's eyes moved toward Mom. That small movement was enough to tell me she had not merely discovered the answer herself. They both knew. What followed was not a neat confession. It came out in pieces, because they kept trying to control how much each piece meant. Months earlier, when Sloane's expansion began running short of cash, Mom and Dad had given her approximately $40,000 from liquid savings. They had treated it as temporary support, something she would replace when the new location gained traction. The traction never came. Later, when the revolving line was extended and kept in place, they had pledged a taxable brokerage account connected to the arrangement. The account had been worth roughly $180,000 when they put it behind the line. Dad kept insisting that the account was not the same thing as owing the entire balance. Technically, he was right. Their guarantee and the pledged assets interacted with the lender agreement in ways I was not going to pretend I could fully interpret across my kitchen table. But the important fact required no specialized knowledge. My parents had already put serious money at risk, and they had hidden that fact while asking me to sell Piper's bungalow for approximately $260,000. The math stopped looking coincidental. The bungalow proceeds would be enough to address the revolving line that threatened the account they had pledged. Piper's future had not just been selected because Sloan needed money. It had been selected because the amount was convenient for Mom and Dad, too. That understanding entered me slowly. I looked at my mother's hands. The same hands that had held a water glass at the first family meeting, while she explained that Piper was young enough to recover. Mom had not been speaking only as Sloan's mother. She had been speaking as someone whose own savings were on the line. I asked when they had intended to tell me. Neither had a good answer. Mom returned to the belief that the arrangement had looked safe when they entered it. Dad said they had expected Sloan's business to improve. Neither explanation addressed why they had allowed me to sit at that dining table and hear the bungalow presented as an act of family generosity instead of a way to protect money they had already risked. I asked Dad why he had signed. He leaned back and pressed both hands onto his knees. His face looked older than it had 2 weeks earlier. The anger that usually sharpened him had worn down into defensiveness. He said Sloan had needed someone to stand behind her while the business grew. She had a record of success. She had employees. The second location had been ambitious, but ambition was not a crime. He and Mom had believed the risk was manageable. Then came the sentence I had heard in different forms my entire life. If the worst happened, the family would figure it out. I asked him again what that meant. He looked at me. Not at Mom. At me. He said they knew I would never let the family actually lose the money. There it was. Not a contract. Not a promise. A belief. They had risked their savings with Sloan because somewhere in the background of the decision stood the assumption that if things became bad enough, I would absorb the final impact. I felt something inside me go very still. It was not rage. Rage would have been easier. This was the sensation of recognizing a shape that had existed in your life for years without ever seeing the whole outline. I thought of being 16 and giving up the horticulture program because I was the mature one. I thought of every small family emergency I had solved without tracking the cost. A missed payment covered, a trip reorganized, a repair handled, a problem that became mine because I could fix it faster. None of those things had been large enough to feel dangerous alone. Together, they had taught my family something I had never intended to teach them. Marin will handle it. Marin can afford it. Marin will not let us fall. And because I had never forced anyone to test what happened when I refused, they had built financial decisions around a version of me that had never actually agreed to exist. I asked Mom when I had promised to reimburse them if Sloan failed. She stared down at the table. Dad answered instead, saying no one was claiming I had made a formal promise. That was not what I had asked. I asked when I had told them Piper's bungalow could be used. Again, silence. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the street. The sound traveled through the kitchen window in a low mechanical hum. Mom eventually said they had believed I would understand once the situation became serious enough. That sentence hurt more than I wanted it to. Understand. As if consent could be manufactured retroactively, by making the emergency frightening enough. I did not raise my voice. I told them the bungalow was not being sold. I also told them they were not to discuss it privately with Piper again. Mom immediately said she had only been trying to help Piper understand what the family was facing. I told her a child did not need to understand a lender's collateral position in order to decide whether adults should spend her future. That ended the explanation. Dad looked toward the hall, toward the stairs where Piper's room was above us. For once, he did not argue. When they left, I stood in the kitchen long after the front door closed. I had expected learning the truth to make the situation clearer. Instead, it had multiplied the questions. The guarantee was larger in meaning than I had understood. The pledged account made the desperation real. The $40,000 told me this had been going on for months, but none of it explained one thing. Why had Mom and Dad been so confident that I would rescue them? They had not merely hoped. They had acted. Dad had signed. Mom had agreed. Money had already moved. You do not usually risk that much based on a vague impression that your oldest daughter is generous. Someone had made my future participation sound more certain. The next evening, Dad called me. His voice was quieter than usual. I expected another attempt to persuade me to stop the sale. Instead, he began by saying that I needed to understand something about how the guarantee had happened. I waited. He struggled through several sentences about timing and what Sloan had believed when the business was still expanding. Then he said the one thing that rearranged the entire story again. Sloan told us you were on board if things ever got this bad. I did not answer immediately. Across the room, Piper had left one of her photographs on the coffee table, a picture of an old Omaha house with a blue front door and cracked stone steps. I stared at it, while Dad kept breathing on the other end of the call. Until that moment, I had believed Sloan expected me to rescue her. Now I understood something worse. She had been using the expectation of my rescue to convince other people they could afford to take risks too. The sentence stayed in my head long after Dad hung up. Sloan told us you were on board if things ever got this bad. Not Marin might help. Not Marin has resources. On board. The phrase carried the weight of consent, without any of the inconvenience of asking for it. For 2 days, I did not call Sloan. That was unusual for me. In the past, when something in the family made no sense, I usually moved toward it. I asked questions, gathered details, made a list, found the most efficient way to reduce damage. Silence had always felt passive to me. This time it felt necessary. I needed to know whether I wanted an explanation or an argument. Those were not the same thing, and Sloan was skilled at turning one into the other. At work, the season was beginning to tilt toward fall. The garden center still carried the bright weight of late summer, but some of the annuals were tired around the edges, and the first shipments of mums had begun arriving. I walked through the outdoor rows early one morning, checking leaves for stress and making notes about what needed to be discounted before it lost value altogether. The irony was not subtle. Plants taught you quickly that refusing to admit decline did not preserve anything. Sometimes the healthiest decision was pruning. Sometimes it was cutting a section back so the rest could survive. Sloan had built a business around interiors and presentation. She understood balance and proportion in a room better than anyone I knew. But when it came to her own company, she seemed incapable of removing anything from the composition. I finally called her near the end of that week. I did not begin with Dad's guarantee, the brokerage account, or the bungalow. I asked one question. What exactly had she told Mom and Dad before they agreed to back her line? She was quiet for a moment. Then she did what she always did when she believed a word was technically defensible. She narrowed it. She said she had never claimed I had signed anything, never said I had promised a specific amount, never told them I had legally committed Piper's bungalow. That was all true. It also answered a different question. I waited until she stopped talking. Then I asked why she had told them I would step in if things became serious. The answer came without hesitation. Because you always do. She did not say it cruelly. That was the part that made it worse. There was no triumph in her voice, no villainous pleasure. She said it like someone explaining why the sun would rise the next morning. Because you always do. The words pushed me backward, Through years of family emergencies, I had stopped classifying as sacrifice. The Christmas furnace I got repaired before dinner, the utility shortfall I covered during Sloane's first lean year, the surgery week when I reorganized Dad's transportation, meals, and follow-up care before anyone else had decided who could help. None of those things had ruined me. Each had been small enough to absorb, and that was why the pattern became invisible. I thought I was solving separate problems. My family learned something broader. When something went wrong, Marin would make it manageable. That did not excuse Sloane for using an expectation about me to support a financial risk I had never approved, but it explained why she could say, "Because you always do," without malice. I hated watching preventable damage spread, and somewhere along the way my generosity had stopped looking optional. Sloane kept talking after the line that mattered, trying to explain that she genuinely believed I would understand if the crisis became large enough. I barely needed the rest. The sentence had already exposed the system more clearly than any spreadsheet could. I ended the conversation without promising anything. That afternoon, I looked at the whiteboard in my office, where every crew problem, repair, and supplier issue had an owner beside it. At work, responsibility was ordinary. Damaged irrigation belonged to the crew that damaged it, a short shipment to the vendor, a bad estimate to my company. At home, responsibility had always been more fluid. Sloane made a decision, Mom worried, Dad guaranteed, and the consequence kept moving until it found me. That week, the family story began traveling through a few phone calls, each one smoothing away the details that made the situation uncomfortable. An aunt I spoke to perhaps 4 times a year contacted me after hearing I was selling Mom and Dad's house over a fight about Sloane. Her concern was genuine, but the version she had received had removed nearly everything that mattered. Dad's comment about Piper had become an argument. The ownership of the property had blurred. The $900,000 debt had been reduced to Sloane having business trouble. I explained only the essentials. My parents did not own the house. They were not being evicted overnight. They had a transition period. And I was not selling Piper's bungalow to finance Sloane's business. My aunt did not entirely agree with me, but at least she stopped talking, as if I had stripped my parents of a deed they possessed. Another relative called 2 days later and took a different path. He asked one basic question: did Mom and Dad own the property? When I said no, there was a long pause. He did not suddenly take my side. He simply became quieter. That was enough. People responded differently when the facts were allowed to remain attached to the story. I did not call anyone else to defend myself. For years, I had believed family peace required correcting every misunderstanding before it hardened. Now I let some of them harden. Not every opinion needed my maintenance. Meanwhile, Tobias Reed's limited review reached the point where Sloane had to make a choice. She still had not produced everything he wanted. There were enough records for him to see the direction of the business, but not enough for him to endorse anyone injecting fresh family money into it. His message to me was brief and professional. He believed an orderly contraction still had a reasonable chance of reducing damage, but only if Sloane stopped treating every major asset as untouchable. He would not recommend a bailout on the information provided. He also would not continue pretending the incomplete records were enough to build one. Sloane reacted as though he had abandoned her. She called Mom first. I knew that because Mom called me 20 minutes later and repeated several of Sloane's complaints nearly word for word. Tobias had supposedly become too conservative. He did not understand her market. He saw distress, but not brand value. He wanted to dismantle a business that could recover if someone gave it time. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked Mom one question I had started using whenever the conversation became vague. What exactly was Sloane willing to sell? Mom did not know. That ended the call faster than anything else could have. The answer did not change over the following days. Sloane still had reasons to protect the condo, flagship showroom, second location, and premium inventory. Piper's future remained the one asset everyone had been willing to treat as expendable. Dana called me on a Thursday afternoon with the first serious offer on my parents' rental. A couple relocating within Omaha liked the neighborhood, could accommodate the existing transition timeline, and made a credible, properly financed offer close enough to the valuation that Dana considered it worth taking seriously. I sat in my office with the email open and felt none of the satisfaction I had expected. This was no longer a realtor standing on my parents' porch while Mom screamed into the phone. This was a number, a closing window, a family who might eventually eat dinner in the kitchen Mom had arranged 8 years earlier. Dana walked me through the offer, the proposed timing, the normal contingencies, and what it would mean for the transition period. I listened, took notes, and told her I needed a little time before responding. For the rest of the afternoon, I carried the decision around with me. I checked on a crew installing stone steps. I answered 2 supplier calls. I stood beside a row of maples while an employee asked whether to move the remaining stock before the weekend heat. Everything required a decision. The house required something else. A reason. When I got home, Piper was at the kitchen table doing algebra with the expression of someone personally betrayed by variables. I did not mention the offer immediately. I made tea, reheated leftovers, and let the ordinary half-hour exist before adding another adult problem to the room. Later, I told her, she did not ask whether the price was good. She asked whether I was actually selling or whether I had only wanted Grandma and Grandpa to believe I would. The question sat between us. I told her I did not know yet. That was the most honest answer I had. We ordered takeout that night because neither of us wanted to cook. I ordered too much Chinese food, partly because I was distracted, and partly because leftovers solved a problem I could control. When the containers covered nearly half the counter, Piper looked at them and said, "You bought enough for the relatives we're not speaking to. Leftovers have never asked me for collateral." She laughed. So did I. The sound surprised me. For a few seconds there was no debt, no guarantee, no house sale, no family hierarchy. Just 2 people standing in a kitchen with too many noodles. The relief did not make the problem disappear. It made it easier to see. After Piper went upstairs, I opened Dana's email again. I asked myself the same question I had avoided earlier. If Dad apologized perfectly tomorrow, would I still want to end the housing arrangement? This time, the answer was yes. For 8 years, below-market rent had gradually become emotional ownership, and my parents had begun counting not only that house, but my other property as part of the family's reserve. I could regret the anger that opened the file, and still conclude that the arrangement itself needed to end. So I called Dana the next morning and told her to proceed with negotiations on the offer. Afterward, I sat quietly at my desk. No rush, no triumph, only a sense that something which had been temporary for 8 years was finally becoming temporary again. I made one other decision that morning. Whatever money I eventually cleared from the sale would not go to Sloan, not as a loan, not as a bridge, not as one last rescue to keep Mom and Dad calm. If I sold the property, I would not transform the proceeds into the very family emergency fund I was trying to stop being. That decision had barely settled when Sloan called. Her voice sounded exhausted. The second location was weakening faster than she had admitted. Vendor pressure had increased. Tobias had made clear he would not validate a rescue plan built on partial disclosure. She had spoken with other advisors, and for the first time she used the word she had avoided since the crisis began: bankruptcy. She did not say it with fear exactly. She said it with the strange confidence of someone who had found a door labeled exit and assumed whatever lay behind it had to be easier than the room she was in. She had begun looking into personal bankruptcy protection because, as a sole proprietor, the business obligations and her personal financial exposure were intertwined. She spoke in broad terms about stopping the bleeding, getting breathing room, and eventually rebuilding. I did not argue with her legal assumptions. I was not her lawyer. I told her only that if she was considering bankruptcy, She needed proper counsel and complete honesty about everything she owned and owed. She brushed past that part. What mattered to her was relief, a clean reset, a chance to shut down what was failing, and emerge later without dragging every old obligation behind her. Mom heard the word bankruptcy very differently. Within an hour, she and Dad were both calling me. Their panic had sharpened. Because whatever protection Sloane might receive through her own process, Dad's guarantee did not simply evaporate because she filed something. For the first time, Mom seemed to understand that there might not be a family maneuver large enough to keep every consequence suspended. She asked whether I would reconsider helping them bridge the immediate problem before Sloane did anything irreversible. I said no. The word felt less dramatic than I had expected. No lecture, no explanation. Just no. That evening, Dad called one last time. His voice was quiet enough that I could hear paper moving in the background. The lender had sent formal communication tied to the revolving line and his guarantee. Until then, the risk had lived mostly inside conversations. Numbers on my notebook, clauses I had not seen, warnings Sloane kept describing as manageable. Now the bank had put the consequences in writing. Dad did not read the letter to me. He did not need to. For the first time, the loss was no longer something he believed I could prevent before it became real. And there was no Marin-shaped solution waiting behind it. The lender's letter changed the atmosphere in my family more than any argument had. Until then, everyone had been living inside possibilities. Sloane might stabilize the business. Mom and Dad might avoid losing the money they had put behind her. I might still change my mind. Dana's buyer might disappear. Tobias might eventually admit that one large cash injection could make everything workable again. The letter removed one of those cushions. The bank had begun treating Dad's guarantee as something it intended to enforce, not as a frightening paragraph everyone could postpone discussing. I did not see the letter itself. Dad did not offer to show it to me, and I did not ask. I knew enough from what he told me to understand that the lender was no longer waiting for Sloane to solve the revolving line on her own. Whatever negotiations happened next belonged to the people who had signed those documents. For the first time, I tried not to insert myself between a problem and its consequence. That turned out to be harder than listing the house. Sloane's second showroom closed first. The announcement did not arrive with drama. A temporary reduction in hours became a closure date. Employees who had spent weeks hearing that the company was restructuring began finding other work. A few stayed long enough to help inventory what remained. Others left as soon as their final schedules ended, taking the quiet knowledge with them that optimism did not pay rent. I heard most of it through Sloane and Mom. I did not visit the showroom to watch it happen. I did not need to. For months, Sloane had described closing that location as the beginning of the end. When it finally happened, Omaha kept moving. Cars still passed the storefront. Other businesses opened their doors in the morning. Customers who had once treated Sloane's expansion as proof of success went elsewhere when they needed furniture. Failure had been catastrophic in her imagination because everyone would see it. Once it became visible, it looked mostly like an emptying building. That did not make it painless. People lost jobs. Sloane lost something she had worked hard to build. Vendors stopped extending the easy patience they had once given a growing client. The leased SUV that had gleamed in my parents' driveway during the first family meeting disappeared from her routine as the business contracted. It had never contained enough equity to solve the debt, but surrendering the status attached to it seemed to hurt her more than admitting the car itself had been financially useless. Sloane responded to every loss by placing me somewhere inside it. According to Mom, she said the showroom closure proved I had gotten what I wanted. The first time I heard that, I was standing in the garden center's loading area watching one of my employees cut plastic wrap from a pallet of late-season shrubs. I looked at the muddy concrete beneath my boots and thought about how easy it would have been to accept Sloane's version. If I had sold the bungalow, perhaps the line would have been cured. Perhaps the second showroom would still be open. Perhaps some employees would still have jobs. Those possibilities could produce guilt if I stared at them in isolation, but the business had expanded and accumulated debt before anyone asked me for money, and Sloane had rejected contraction, while she still had more control. The employees losing jobs were real. So was the chain of choices that had brought the company there. The guarantee became real in my parents' lives at the same time. Dad stopped talking about the pledged investment account, as though it were something theoretical. The lender's pressure forced him and Mom to sit with the possibility that money they had spent decades accumulating might actually be used to satisfy the risk they had chosen. Mom called me one evening after she and Dad had spent most of the day talking to financial professionals. Her voice was not angry. That made the conversation harder. She did not ask for $260,000 this time. She asked for a bridge loan, something smaller, temporary, enough to reduce pressure while Sloane worked through the shutdown and explored what came next. She said Dad had retirement income. They were not asking me to support them forever, and they could work out repayment once the dust settled. A month earlier, I could have said no while Dad's sentence about Piper burned in my ears. Anger would have carried me. That evening, there was only my mother sounding tired. I sat at my kitchen table with my phone beside a bowl of unopened mail and listened as she explained why a loan from me would be safer than allowing the bank to decide how much of their exposed savings disappeared. Every instinct I had developed over 39 years told me to calculate. How much did they need? Could I afford it? Could the business distribute something without affecting payroll? What repayment schedule would make sense? The questions appeared automatically, one after another, like lights switching on in rooms I had entered many times. I let them go dark again. Mom and Dad had signed the guarantee. They had pledged the account. They had done both while believing that my money would be available if their decision became painful. If I lent them the bridge, I would not merely be helping elderly parents through a difficult season, I would be proving the assumption correct. I told Mom I was not lending the money. There was a silence long enough that I could hear the refrigerator cycle on behind me. She did not scream. She said she hoped I understood what I was choosing. I did. That was why the word no felt so heavy. Afterward, I sat at the table until Piper came downstairs looking for a charger. She glanced at my face, looked at the untouched mail, and asked whether Grandma had called. I told her yes. I did not give her the details. She nodded, found the charger, and left the kitchen without asking whether I had fixed the problem. That small absence mattered. For once, nobody in my house assumed I should. As the sale moved forward, my parents began packing. There is something different about seeing boxes compared with talking about a listing agreement. A listing is a transaction. Boxes are life being reduced into what comes with you. Piper and I went to the house one weekend because she had left a portfolio of old photographs there after visiting months earlier, and I needed to collect a few property items before the next stage of the sale. I had considered going alone. Piper chose to come. The front room looked smaller with packing boxes against the walls. Mom had already removed family photographs from one shelf, leaving pale rectangles where the frames had protected the paint from years of sun. Dad's books were stacked in liquor store boxes near the hallway. The dining table where he had called Piper that adopted girl was covered with newspaper and dishes waiting to be wrapped. Piper stopped just inside the living room. Her expression changed. Not forgiveness. Sadness. I knew better than to correct it. People sometimes act as if moral clarity should make loss emotionally simple. If someone hurt you, you should feel nothing when they suffer. If you feel compassion, perhaps the boundary was too harsh. If the consequence makes you sad, perhaps it was wrong. Real life was less cooperative. Piper loved her grandparents. That had been true before Dad's sentence. It was still true afterward. Love did not erase what they had done, and what they had done did not erase every good memory inside that house. Mom was upstairs. Dad was in the living room wrapping objects from a cabinet he had apparently decided contained priceless family history. Piper found her portfolio beneath a side table, then noticed a ceramic bird sitting alone on the mantel. It was a ridiculous thing, long-necked, glossy, somewhere between a heron and a goose, painted a blue no bird in nature had ever requested. Mom had owned it for years, and regularly insisted it was valuable whenever anyone suggested moving it somewhere less visible. Piper picked it up carefully. Dad looked over and said the bird was definitely going with them because her grandmother still believed it was worth money. He added, almost under his breath, that he certainly hoped the value was emotional. Piper's mouth twitched. For half a second, so did mine. Nothing about the moment excused him. That was what made it human. A grandfather who had said something unforgivable could still know that his wife's ceramic bird was ugly. A granddaughter he had hurt could still almost laugh. Then Piper wrapped it in newspaper and placed it in the box he indicated. We stayed less than an hour. On the drive home, she was quiet until we were several blocks away. Then she said she felt bad seeing them pack. I kept my eyes on the road. She added that feeling bad did not mean she had forgotten why everything had changed. I told her those two things were allowed to exist together. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then I decided to tell her something I had avoided putting into words. I told her the truth about the night I opened the rental file. I had not only been thinking about boundaries. Part of me had wanted Grandma and Grandpa to experience the shock of having someone else make plans around the place they thought of as their future. I had wanted them to feel what they had asked Piper to feel. The admission sounded smaller once it was outside me, but not cleaner. I told her I was not proud of that part. Piper looked over from the passenger seat. She did not give me permission or condemnation. She simply said she was glad I told her. Then she turned toward the window. That was enough. I had spent much of the story expecting myself to be morally certain because the people opposing me had done something wrong. Piper kept teaching me that protection did not require pretending every impulse behind it was noble. The house sale could still be the right boundary. My first reason for reaching toward it could still contain revenge. Both were true. By the time November gave way to December, Sloane's business had been reduced far enough that bankruptcy stopped being a threat she mentioned and became a legal process she entered. On the 4th of December 2026, she filed an individual Chapter 7 case. Because Sloane Caldwell Interiors had always operated as her sole proprietorship rather than a separate corporation, there was no neat wall between Sloane and the business for purposes of the property she owned. Her personal case included the remaining non-exempt assets tied to the business. I understood only the broad outline. I did not need more. A trustee would review what existed, creditors would have rights, and Sloane would have to disclose what she owned, owed, had transferred, and still controlled. Her lawyer handled the legal details. For our family, the emotional version was simpler. Sloane said bankruptcy meant the worst part was finally over. Dad repeated that phrase to me a few days later. He sounded almost relieved. The filing, in his mind, placed the crisis into a system. Forms had been submitted. Lawyers were involved. There were rules now. After months of family negotiations and emergency requests, formal procedure apparently felt like safety. I did not share his confidence, not because I knew bankruptcy law, because I remembered Sloane's inventory. Only weeks before the business began closing, one of her strongest arguments against liquidation had been that the premium stock represented substantial value. Discounting it, she had insisted, would sacrifice too much. She had talked about designer furniture, lighting, imported fixtures, high-end pieces that could generate meaningful cash if handled correctly. Now, after filing, the way she described what remained was different. Most of the valuable inventory, she said, had already been sold through the shutdown, returned where possible, used to satisfy vendors, or otherwise disappeared from the operating business. I did not have access to her schedules. I did not see her bankruptcy filings. I did not begin searching county records, storage facilities, invoices, or bank statements. I simply remembered two versions of the same inventory. In the first version, it was too valuable to liquidate. In the second, very little of it seemed to remain. That could have had innocent explanations. A failing retail business burns through inventory. Goods get sold. Consignment pieces go back. Secured creditors assert rights. Vendors negotiate returns. I knew enough about business to understand that physical stock could leave in ordinary ways. So I did nothing. That was new too. Old Marin would have started making calls until every inconsistency had a label. This problem did not belong to me. If Sloan had properly accounted for everything, the process would sort itself out. If she had not, that was also not something I needed to manufacture. The first sign that someone else had noticed came through Sloan herself. Routine bankruptcy scrutiny began after the filing. I knew only what she chose to complain about. Her attorney had apparently warned her repeatedly to answer questions accurately and provide whatever records were requested. The trustee wanted information about inventory movement, business records, and property that had left the showroom before the filing. Sloan treated the requests as harassment. One evening, I stopped by my parents' place for a practical handoff connected to the property. Packing boxes still crowded the rooms, and the house had acquired that strange temporary feeling that comes when half of a life has already been wrapped in cardboard. Sloan arrived while I was there. She came through the front door carrying a leather folder and the expression she used whenever somebody outside the family had refused to accept her explanation. Mom immediately moved toward her. Dad remained near the dining table. I stayed where I was. Sloan had just come from dealing with questions related to the bankruptcy case. She complained that the trustee wanted more records about inventory that had not been at the main showroom when the business shut down. There were also questions about off-site storage and another business name connected to some of the records. She described the second name as something she had been considering for a future venture. I knew enough from running my own business to understand that a name did not automatically make property belong to somebody else. I did not say that. Her lawyer had already told her to produce the requested records and answer accurately. Sloan thought the whole process was excessive. In her version, the trustee was taking a failed business and treating every imperfect record as suspicious. Mom began reassuring her before the story was finished. Dad asked practical questions I did not fully hear. I watched Sloan. She was angry, but underneath the anger was a tension I recognized. It was the same tension I had seen when Tobias asked what assets she was willing to sacrifice. The same tightness that had appeared when I refused to sell the bungalow. For months, Sloan had reacted to pressure as though every person asking her to give something up had misunderstood what she deserved to keep. The difference now was that I had nothing to do with the person asking. The trustee had not met Piper. The trustee had not heard Dad's insult. The trustee did not care that I had listed my parents' rental. Whatever questions existed had come from Sloan's own records and her own disclosures. That seemed to bother her most. She finally looked directly at me. They're acting like I hid something. The room went quiet enough that I heard cardboard shift inside one of the half-packed boxes near the wall. I said nothing. Sloan's eyes stayed on mine. "And if they keep digging," she added, "Mom and Dad are going to blame you for that too." Sloan's accusation followed me out of my parents' house, but not for the reason she intended. She had wanted me to hear a warning in it. If the trustee kept asking questions, Mom and Dad would blame me. A few months earlier, that possibility would have occupied me for days. I would have replayed every choice I had made, searched for the exact point where refusing to help might somehow have caused someone else to behave badly, and then tried to repair the emotional damage before anyone had to ask. By then, I was beginning to understand how dangerous that reflex had been. I had not prepared Sloan's bankruptcy schedules. I had not moved her inventory. I had not answered questions for her. Whatever happened next would come from the distance between what she had owned, what she had disclosed, and what the records showed. The process moved more slowly than Sloane's anger made it sound. The process moved slowly. What emerged came in pieces, and most of those pieces reached me because Sloane complained about them. My parents repeated what she had told them, or I was later asked to confirm facts I actually knew. I was not investigating her. I was watching a pattern she could no longer control. The first piece was the inventory itself. Before the shutdown, Sloane had spent months insisting that her premium stock represented real value. She had resisted aggressive liquidation because discounting designer furniture, imported lighting, custom fixtures, and high-end accessories would destroy the brand. That argument had helped justify why she needed outside money, rather than a fire sale. Now the trustees' questions were exposing a problem with that story. Some inventory that should have been accounted for was missing from the picture. From what Sloane complained about, the trustee was comparing old ledgers with vendor and freight records, storage invoices, and information from a former employee. The facts reached me in pieces, rather than one dramatic packet. But by the time they converged, roughly $120,000 worth of premium inventory appeared to have been moved out of the operating showroom before bankruptcy and kept in commercial storage under another trade name, Sloane described as a future venture. The phrase future venture told me almost everything about how she had justified it to herself. She had not thought of the stock as something she was taking away from creditors. She had thought of it as something she had earned the right to preserve. When she finally spoke to me about it directly, she did not deny that goods had been moved. She denied what the move meant. The business, she said, had been hers. The inventory had come through her company. Some of it had been sitting for months. She had intended to use it later if she rebuilt. In her mind, placing it somewhere else before shutting down was not the same as stealing. Her lawyer had apparently explained the problem in far less emotional terms. Ownership was not defined by how she felt about the goods. A different trade name did not magically create a different legal owner. And once she entered bankruptcy, she did not get to decide which property belonged to her old life and which could be reserved for her next one without accurately disclosing it. I did not need the legal details. The moral problem was simpler. Sloane had spent the entire crisis resisting any solution that required her to lose something visible. Now, even after the business collapsed, she had tried to carry a valuable piece of it through the wreckage with her. The stock was supposed to survive. Her future venture was supposed to survive. Her ability to begin again quickly was supposed to survive. Everyone else could absorb the damage. That idea had become so familiar in our family that I almost missed how perfectly the inventory fit it. Piper's bungalow had been treated the same way in reverse. Her future could be sacrificed because she had time to recover. Sloane's future had to be protected because starting over would be humiliating. Mom called me again before the inventory issue had fully settled. Her voice had the exhausted softness she had used when asking for a bridge loan. The house move had already forced her and Dad into a smaller financial life, and the guarantee was pressing harder against their exposed savings. Sloane's bankruptcy had not erased their obligations. If anything, the legal scrutiny had made Mom more desperate to find some remaining way to reduce the damage. She asked whether I would reconsider putting money in now. Not enough to save the old business. That fantasy had finally weakened. Enough, she said, to help Sloane settle some remaining problems, reduce pressure, and perhaps prevent the whole situation from becoming worse than it already was. There was a time when the phrase, "prevent it from becoming worse," would have been nearly impossible for me to resist. I had built half my adult identity around preventing things from becoming worse. I stood in the back office of the garden center while Mom spoke, looking at a maintenance schedule pinned beside the door. A pump replacement had been moved up because the bearings were failing. One of the delivery trucks needed tires before winter. 2 employees had requested the same Friday off, and the schedule had to be rearranged. Those were problems I was responsible for. They belonged to me. Sloane's concealment did not. I told Mom the stage where money could erase choices had passed. She went quiet. Dad asked me separately 2 days later, He did not pressure me the way he once would have. His request came without speeches, about blood or duty. He simply asked whether there was any amount I was willing to provide that might make things easier. That was harder. Anger had never been the only thing holding the boundary together, but it had helped. Dad sounded tired now, smaller somehow. I still said no. For the first time, he did not tell me what kind of daughter that made me. The change did not feel like victory. It felt like a man beginning to understand that my answer would remain an answer even after his authority stopped supporting it. Piper knew only the broad version of what was happening. I told her Aunt Sloane's bankruptcy had questions attached to it because some business inventory had not been accounted for properly. I did not explain statutes, discharge rules, or criminal exposure. She was still a teenager who occasionally forgot to bring a water bottle to school. She did not need to become the family's bankruptcy analyst. What she did want was one conversation with her grandparents. That surprised me. Since Mom's private call, Piper had chosen distance. She had not blocked them, but she had stopped answering every message immediately. She had declined 2 invitations to visit. I had let her decide what contact felt safe. Then one Saturday she told me she wanted to ask them something while I was there. She did not want an apology performance. She did not want Grandpa to tell her she was real family. That phrase had become almost irrelevant to her. She wanted to understand the order. So we met Mom and Dad at their smaller apartment. The place was clean and comfortable, but the scale of it told the story before anyone spoke. The living room furniture fit tightly. Dad's old workbench was gone. Several boxes remained stacked along one wall, because there was nowhere obvious to put what had once filled a 3-bedroom house. Piper noticed. I saw it in the way her eyes moved around the room. She did not look pleased. That mattered to me. If this story had taught her to enjoy other people's loss, I would have failed in a way no protected bungalow could repair. Mom made tea. Dad sat in the chair nearest the window. I stayed beside Piper on the couch and did not take over the conversation. She asked the question herself. Why had her bungalow been the first thing they wanted to sell before Sloane's condo or business property? Mom answered in the same framework she had used from the beginning, though without the confidence she once had. Piper was young. She had time. The bungalow was for a future that had not happened yet. Sloane's crisis was immediate. Piper listened. Her face did not collapse. She did not argue that she deserved more love. She only said that being younger should not have made her future cheaper. Mom's hands tightened around the teacup. There was nothing complicated enough in Piper's sentence for her to debate. Dad looked down at his hands. The apartment became quiet. Piper asked him whether he had really signed the guarantee, believing I would help if things went wrong. Dad took longer to answer than I expected. Then he said yes. Piper asked whether anyone had asked me first. Dad's eyes lifted to mine briefly, then returned to her. No. That one word did more than any apology he could have offered. There was no justification attached to it. No, but your mother always helps. No, we thought family would understand. Just no. I watched Piper absorb the answer. She did not smile. She did not punish him. She leaned back against the couch and folded her hands in her lap. That was all. For the first time, Dad seemed to see the decision from outside himself. He had not merely trusted his younger daughter. He had made a financial commitment based partly on another daughter's resources, without asking whether those resources were available. He had treated my consent as something predictable enough to substitute for obtaining it. We stayed another 20 minutes. The conversation did not repair the family. It did something more useful. It made the injury specific. Before we left, Mom tried to tell Piper that she had never meant to make her feel unimportant. Piper accepted the sentence without relieving her of it. She said she understood Grandma had been afraid. Then she added that being afraid did not answer the question. Mom looked away. That was the last thing Piper needed to say. On the drive home, she did not ask whether Grandpa's admission meant she should forgive him. She asked if I thought he finally understood. I told her I thought he had begun to. Beginnings were not endings. That evening, Dad asked me to come by alone the next day. He had something else he wanted to tell me. We met in the apartment kitchen. Without Mom in the room, the place felt even smaller. A half-empty box of old files sat on the floor beside the table. Dad had spent the morning sorting paperwork from the move, and several yellowed warranty documents were stacked near his elbow. He looked exhausted. The family crisis had changed him physically in ways I had not noticed while I was angry. His shoulders curved more when he sat. His face seemed looser around the eyes. The man who had once flattened his palm on the dining table and told me who counted as real family now looked like someone who had finally discovered that authority could not cancel a signature. He said Piper's question had been bothering him, not the one about blood, the one about whether anyone had asked me. Then he told me what Sloane had actually said before he signed the guarantee. Until that moment, I knew only the shortened version. She had told them I was on board if things got bad. That had already been enough to anger me. The full version was worse. Dad said the conversation happened months before our first family meeting, when Sloane was still presenting the expansion as difficult but recoverable. The lender wanted more protection. Dad was hesitating. Sloane had reassured him. Marin won't let us lose it. If it ever gets bad enough, she has Piper's place. The room seemed to narrow around the sentence. I could hear the refrigerator motor running behind me. The clock above the stove clicked forward. Dad kept talking, but for several seconds the words did not arrange themselves into meaning. The bungalow had not become the family's target in panic after everything collapsed. Sloane had already named it, months earlier, before Mom summoned me to the dining table, before Dad insulted Piper, before any of them asked me a single question. My daughter's future had existed inside their risk calculation, before I even knew there was a calculation. Dad said he believed Sloane because of me, not because I had promised, because of the history. I always handled things. I had helped before. I owned property. My business was stable. And in Dad's mind, if losing his savings became the alternative, I would never stand by and allow it. The ugliness was not that he thought I loved him. Of course I loved him. The ugliness was that love had been translated into guaranteed liquidity. I looked down at the table between us. For weeks I had been asking when my family had started treating my resources as collateral. The answer was becoming clearer. There had not been one moment. There had been years of small rescues. Then one person, Sloane, had converted the pattern into a promise I never made, and Dad had been willing to sign against it. I asked him why he had not called me. His face tightened. He said he should have. There were many things I could have said after that. I could have reminded him of the sentence he had used about Piper. I could have asked whether blood had mattered less when he needed the asset belonging to the adopted granddaughter he dismissed. I could have made him sit inside the hypocrisy until neither of us could breathe. I did not. The facts were doing enough. I left the apartment with a different understanding of the first family meeting. Sloane had not been sitting quietly while Mom proposed a clever solution. She had been watching a plan she had already imagined move into its final stage. That small smile made sense now. She had expected my resistance. She had expected Dad's authority. She had expected Mom's guilt. Most of all, she had expected history. Marin will fix it. The next development in the bankruptcy case came through Sloane several days later. The trustee was no longer asking only questions. The off-site inventory issue had become serious enough that recovery of the goods was being pursued. Sloane's attorney had explained that questions about her sworn disclosures could also affect the discharge she expected from bankruptcy. Creditors and the appropriate bankruptcy authorities were looking at whether what she had reported matched what she had actually controlled. I did not know the private strategy behind any of it. I knew only what Sloane told the family, and what later formal information confirmed. The case had changed. This was no longer about whether she had been a bad business owner. It was about what she had done with property before filing, and what she had said about it afterward. Sloane reacted to that distinction with genuine fear. For the first time, the word bankruptcy stopped sounding like an exit when she used it. The stock she had hoped to preserve could be recovered. The clean reset she had imagined was in jeopardy. The story she had told herself that she was merely carrying something of her own into the future was being measured against records rather than intention. And records were less forgiving than family. Then she called me. I was still at the garden center, finishing paperwork after closing. The greenhouse lights had been switched off one row at a time, leaving the office windows dark except for the reflection of my desk lamp. Sloane did not ask for money. That was what made the call different. She wanted a statement from me, not necessarily formal at first. Something she could repeat, something I could confirm if anyone asked. She wanted me to say there had always been a family understanding that Piper's bungalow could be sold if the business failed badly enough. According to her, that context mattered. It would show why she had believed there was another source of money available, why she had thought she would be able to make things right, why she had not seen the inventory the way the trustee now did. I sat very still while she explained it. Then she gave me the sentence she wanted me to accept. Then they'll understand why I thought I had a way out. I looked at the dark greenhouse beyond my office window. For months, Sloane had asked me to rescue her with money. Now she was asking me to rescue her with a lie. Sloane was not asking for a forged document or a changed date. What she wanted sounded smaller, which was exactly why it was dangerous. She wanted me to confirm that there had always been a family understanding about Piper's bungalow that if her business failed badly enough, I would sell it and use the money to help. In Sloane's version, I would not be lying about ownership. The house really was mine. I really had helped the family before. Mom and Dad really had believed I would step in. She wanted to turn their belief into my agreement. I sat in my office after closing, listening while she explained why that distinction mattered to her. She spoke as though context could soften everything that had happened afterward. If people understood that she had expected another source of money to exist, perhaps they would understand why she had tried to preserve some of the inventory rather than liquidate it. Perhaps her decisions would look less like concealment and more like a business owner trying to protect the pieces she intended to use after the crisis passed. I looked through the dark greenhouse windows at rows of plants, reduced to silhouettes. There had never been an agreement or even a conversation about using the bungalow. Sloane had told Mom and Dad what I would do without asking me. They had acted on that belief, and later treated my consent as overdue. Their history explained the assumption. It did not make the assumption true. I told Sloane there had been no family agreement. She pushed back immediately, though not loudly. Truth, she said, was not always that simple. Families did not write contracts every time they understood how one another would behave. This part is, I said. I did not stay on the phone long enough for the conversation to become an argument. For most of my life, I had treated explanations as a form of kindness. If someone misunderstood me, I tried to clarify until they understood. If they were hurt by a boundary, I explained the reason until the boundary felt less personal. If they disagreed, I found different words. That evening, I learned there was a point where more explanation did not create understanding. It created openings. Sloane did not need to understand why I would not lie. She needed me to lie. The answer was no. Mom tried a different route 2 days later. She came to the garden center in the middle of a cold November afternoon, when the outdoor rows were nearly empty and most of the seasonal staff had already been reduced. A thin wind pushed dried leaves against the edge of the parking lot. Inside the greenhouse, the air smelled of damp soil and evergreen wreaths we had just begun stocking for winter. Mom waited in my office while I finished approving an equipment repair. She looked tired. The move from my rental had become unavoidable by then, and much of the certainty she had carried during the first family meeting had worn away. But fear had not made her less skilled at guilt. If anything, it had made the method more precise. She did not ask me to lie for Sloane. She asked me to help explain. Dad had signed the guarantee because he believed the family would stand behind him. Sloan had believed the same thing. Mom said I could at least acknowledge that history without pretending there had been some formal written promise. Her argument was gentler than Sloan's. That did not make it different. I asked why Dad's decision to rely on something he never asked me to promise had become an obligation for me to validate afterward. Mom's hands were folded tightly in her lap. She said family members were supposed to stand behind one another. I waited for something more specific. Nothing came. The word family had once ended arguments in our house because it was treated as self-proving. By then I had learned to ask who was actually being asked to give, and the answer was rarely Sloan. Mom left without getting what she wanted. Dad surprised me that evening. He called after Mom returned home. His voice was quiet, and at first I assumed he wanted to make the same request in his own way. Instead, he told me not to do it. Not to lie. There was a pause after the words, as though even he was surprised to hear them coming from himself. He said he had signed something he should have examined more cautiously because he wanted to believe Sloan. He had accepted what she said about me because it fit a pattern he already trusted. I had helped before. I had resources. I was stable. He had allowed all of that to become a substitute for consent. He did not excuse what he had said about Piper. He did not suddenly become humble, but for the first time, he stopped trying to move one consequence from himself to me. "That part belongs to me," he said. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone in my hand after the call ended. The sentence did not repair our relationship. It did not return the money he had risked or erase what Piper had heard. But it was the first time, since the crisis began, that Dad had named ownership correctly. The bankruptcy fight had pulled our attention into the new year, but one consequence had become final weeks earlier. In mid-November, inside the transition period I had given them, my parents moved out of the rental. A rented truck sat in the driveway, while two tired people tried to fit 8 years of habit into an apartment with less space. I went because there were practical things connected to the property that I needed to handle, not because Mom asked me to supervise their lives. Piper came by choice. I made that clear to her twice before we left home. She carried one box. That was all. It held kitchen things light enough that Mom had not packed them with the heavier dishes. Piper carried it from the old dining room to Dad's car and set it carefully in the back. No one turned the moment into reconciliation. Mom kept moving through rooms with the distracted energy of someone who still expected the day to reverse itself. More than once, she asked whether Dana had confirmed the closing timeline. Each time, the question seemed to contain another one beneath it. Was I really going to let this happen? Yes. I never said the word. I did not need to. The emptying house answered for me. Dad worked quietly. He had stopped referring to the property as our house around me. Whether that was deliberate or simply exhaustion, I could not tell. Late in the afternoon, I stood in the hallway while he removed the final screws from a wall-mounted rack in the garage. 8 years earlier, when he first moved in, he had asked whether I minded him putting it there. I had forgotten that question until I watched him fill the holes. For years, permission had gradually disappeared from the arrangement. Now it had returned at the end. Mom walked through the kitchen one last time, checking cabinets. She paused beside the window above the sink and ran her fingers over the counter. I remembered helping her carry groceries into that room during their first week there. She and Dad had planned to stay 6 months. At the time, the rental had been a practical favor that cost me very little and gave them breathing room. 6 months became 8 years. There was grief in watching the arrangement end. I did not need to deny it to keep going. When we left that evening, Piper was quiet in the car. She had already seen the boxes once, but an empty house was different. Objects had protected all of us from the truth. Without them, the rooms looked temporary again. I did not ask how she felt. I let her look out the window until she was ready to talk about something else. She eventually asked what we were having for dinner. That small return to ordinary life felt kinder than any speech I could have given her. My parents moved into an apartment they could afford without my subsidy. It was smaller, but it was not unsafe or humiliating. They had retirement income. They had furniture. They had each other. What they no longer had was a 3-bedroom house at below market rent that existed because their oldest daughter had quietly made part of her financial life available to them. A week later, the rental sale closed. Dana handled the ordinary final coordination, the mortgage and selling obligations were paid, and I retained and reinvested the remaining proceeds. Not $1 went to Sloan. Reviewing the closing documents at my kitchen table, I saw the last piece of the boundary clearly. The issue had never been only which house I sold, but whether my property automatically became family rescue money once it turned to cash. The surface revenge was over. My parents had moved, the house had sold. There was nothing left for Dana to do except finish an ordinary file. And yet the deeper consequences were only beginning. The bankruptcy process continued separately from all of that. By then, the off-site inventory issue had moved beyond uncomfortable questions. The trustees' process resulted in the stock being recovered or turned over from the commercial storage arrangement Sloan had used. The second trade name she had attached to the storage did not create a separate legal person. The goods were still hers. That meant they had belonged inside the financial picture she was required to disclose. I learned the broad outcome through Sloan's complaints, and later through facts I was legitimately asked to confirm. I did not see private trustee communications. I did not read internal case strategy. I knew only that the inventory she had hoped to preserve for a future restart was no longer hers to quietly carry forward. That loss hit her differently from the showroom closures. Those had represented the death of the old business. The recovered inventory represented the loss of the next one she had already imagined. For months, Sloan had treated starting over as a right, waiting on the other side of bankruptcy. She had stored enough valuable stock to make that new beginning easier. Now the same stock became part of the process she had hoped to leave behind. Her attorney had apparently warned her that the problem was no longer whether she had managed the company badly. Business failure, by itself, was not what had changed the legal stakes. What mattered was what she had done once insolvency and bankruptcy were real. The disclosures, the movement of property, the sworn answers. A formal challenge was brought against her right to receive the normal Chapter 7 discharge she had expected. I did not try to explain that process to Piper. I did not need to explain much of it to myself either. Sloan had entered bankruptcy, believing the system would separate her from old obligations and allow her to rebuild. Now the system was asking whether she had been honest enough to receive that relief. Mom responded to the development as though another door were closing. She called less often by then, but each call carried more fatigue. She told me Sloan's legal costs were increasing and that everything seemed to be getting worse even though the business itself was already gone. I listened. I did not offer money. That was no longer an act of anger. It was becoming something quieter, a habit in the opposite direction. When people described a problem, I no longer automatically moved toward the center of it. Sometimes, I remained where I was. The consequences continued without me. The most frightening development came later, and almost without ceremony. Sloan learned through her lawyer that concerns about knowing concealment and false sworn information had been referred beyond the ordinary bankruptcy process for criminal review. A referral was not a conviction or a promise of charges, but she understood enough to know that another system was now looking at choices she had once treated as private business decisions. She called me late that evening. I was home. Piper was upstairs, and the dishwasher was running in the kitchen. I remember that sound because it made the conversation feel strangely ordinary. Sloan did not sound angry. The confidence that had survived the showroom closure, bankruptcy filing, inventory questions, and even recovery of the stock had finally disappeared. She wanted me to tell anyone who contacted me that she had been confused. Not that the bungalow was formally pledged this time. Confused, overwhelmed, under pressure. She said she had genuinely believed the inventory was connected to whatever came next, not something she needed to surrender to the old business. I could hear her trying to build an explanation while she spoke. I did not correct her interpretation of the law. I did not accuse her of a crime. I told her I would say only what I actually knew. If anyone properly asked me about the family discussions, I would tell the truth. There had never been an agreement to sell Piper's bungalow. I had never authorized Sloan to treat it as a backup fund. I had not known about the inventory move when it happened. Anything beyond that would belong to people with evidence I had never seen. Sloan was silent for several seconds. Then she asked whether I understood what might happen to her. I did, at least in the broadest sense. For the first time, the consequences she feared could not be priced in houses, inventory, or savings. There were things money could not quietly repair, once facts had entered a formal system. I felt no satisfaction. That surprised me too. Months earlier, I had wanted my family to feel the shock they were willing to hand Piper. I had imagined that if the balance of power reversed hard enough, some part of me would finally feel even. Instead, listening to my sister breathe unevenly on the phone, all I felt was distance, not indifference. Distance. There was a difference. I could care that she was afraid without entering the fear, and carrying it for her. That was new. Sloan finally said the one thing I had never heard from her during the entire crisis. Not when the revolving line was called. Not when Tobias recommended contraction. Not when the second showroom closed. Not when she filed bankruptcy. Not even when the inventory was recovered. What am I supposed to do now? I stood beside my kitchen counter while the dishwasher continued its low mechanical hum. For most of my life, that question would have activated something in me before I had time to think. I would have made a list, found a professional, rearranged money, built a plan, explained the next step, fixed what could be fixed. This time, I did none of those things. I let the silence remain between us, and for the first time in her life, my sister had to sit with a question I was not going to answer for her. For a long time after Sloan asked what she was supposed to do, the legal consequences moved quietly. The physical collapse had been fast. Employees left. The second showroom closed. My parents moved. The inventory was recovered, but the bankruptcy and criminal tracks advanced through calendar dates, document requests, and long stretches when nothing seemed to change. Winter passed, then spring. By April 2027, Piper turned 16. The first warm weekends brought customers back to the garden center, in numbers large enough that I spent most Saturdays moving between the greenhouse, the register, and the outdoor nursery without looking at my phone for hours at a time. People wanted tomato plants, flowering shrubs, grass seed, and advice about yards that had somehow become disasters over winter. My life began containing problems that had nothing to do with Sloan again. That mattered more than I expected. Piper started supervised driving practice not long after her birthday. The first time I let her drive my car through an almost empty shopping center parking lot, she approached every turn, as though the steering wheel controlled a large ship. Her first attempt at parking ended with the car nearly 3 feet from the curb. I looked out the passenger window at the gap. Are we parking one car or leaving room for a second? She kept both hands at 10 and 2 and stared straight ahead. I value personal space. I laughed before I could stop myself. So did she. Then she put the car back in gear and tried again. That tiny moment became one of the clearest signs that our life was recovering. Not because the family crisis had ended. It had not. But because Piper and I could spend 20 minutes arguing with a curb instead of organizing our day around someone else's emergency. The bankruptcy case continued in the background. I learned early to separate what I knew from what people assumed I knew. Because I had been present for the family discussions, I was eventually asked about a narrow set of facts. I confirmed that there had never been permission or an agreement to use Piper's bungalow as a bailout, and that Sloan later asked me to support a different version of that history. I did not speculate about why she moved inventory or what she believed when she signed bankruptcy papers. Those facts belonged to records and people who knew more than I did. For once, I let the gaps remain gaps. The challenge to Sloane's discharge did not resolve quickly. The recovered inventory was only one piece. The larger question was whether her disclosures and sworn answers showed the kind of conduct serious enough to prevent the clean Chapter 7 discharge she had entered bankruptcy expecting. Months passed while that issue moved through the proper process. Sloane's attitude changed repeatedly during that time. Some weeks, she insisted the whole matter had been exaggerated. Other weeks, she treated the possibility of losing the discharge as an injustice created by technical rules no ordinary business owner could understand. Occasionally, she sounded genuinely frightened. What she never sounded was confused about the inventory existing. That distinction stayed with me. Her attorney continued handling the legal side. I did not attend hearings I had no reason to attend, and I did not turn the case into family entertainment. Eventually, after the adversary proceeding ran its course, the bankruptcy court denied Sloane's Chapter 7 discharge based on the established concealment and false oath conduct. The recovered inventory remained available to the creditor process, and the clean reset she had expected was gone. Sloane had entered bankruptcy believing it was a doorway out of the old business. The case forced her to face the condition she had tried to work around full disclosure. I felt no urge to celebrate. There was satisfaction in seeing a fact remain a fact even after Sloane tried to rename it. But watching someone lose legal relief was not the same thing as winning. If anything, the longer the process lasted, the less I thought of Sloane's punishment as part of my own story. She had moved beyond anything I could have caused by refusing money. My parents' consequences were quieter. The lender's rights under their guarantee continued working through the reality Dad had spent months hoping I would prevent. A large portion of the non-retirement savings they had knowingly put at risk disappeared into that obligation. Their taxable investment cushion shrank substantially, but they were not destitute. They still had retirement income, an apartment, and an ordinary life. What disappeared was the cushion they had assumed could be protected if the family rallied hard enough. The same money Mom had been trying to save when she asked Piper to volunteer the bungalow. At first, Dad spoke about the loss as though it had happened to him. Later, his language changed. He began saying he had lost money. He had chosen to risk. That difference was small enough that most people would have missed it. I did not. Mom changed less. She still described the guarantee as something they had done for their daughter, which was true. She also still had a way of leaving out the part where helping Sloane had included, assuming another daughter would eventually absorb the downside. The smaller apartment became normal. Dad learned the building's maintenance number. Mom complained about the kitchen storage, and then gradually figured out where everything fit. No one died from living within their actual means. That fact was almost embarrassingly ordinary. The family system had treated it as catastrophe because the alternative required admitting that stability was not something other people owed them. Sloane tried to rebuild professionally before the legal problems were finished. That did not surprise me. Starting over had always been the part she cared about most. She began talking about a smaller design venture, one that would supposedly avoid the overhead mistakes of the showroom model. She still had talent. She still understood clients. Those things had not disappeared because the business failed. But the professional world remembered more than she wanted it to. Former vendors would not extend the same credit, and business contacts who had watched invoices stretch longer than promised became cautious. Without easy trust or the inventory she had hoped to carry forward, the relaunch remained much smaller than the identity she was trying to recover. Mom treated that as another tragedy. I saw it differently. For once, Sloane's next beginning had to fit inside what people were actually willing to give her instead of what she expected family to supply. The criminal track took longer still. For much of 2027, I knew only that the concealment issue was being reviewed separately from the bankruptcy case, and by then my contact with Sloane was limited. Late that year, the matter became formal, and in early 2028, she pleaded guilty to a federal bankruptcy fraud count tied to knowingly concealing property from the bankruptcy estate. The false sworn answers remained part of the factual history, and the sentence included a short but real federal custodial term measured in months, followed by supervised release and financial consequences. Business failure, aggressive borrowing, and pride had brought Sloan to bankruptcy. Those choices were not themselves the crime. The legal line was crossed when she hid property in a process built on disclosure. My refusal to rescue her had not crossed it for her. A few weeks before Sloan's sentencing, Mom came to my house. Piper was out with a friend, which I later considered fortunate. Mom looked older than she had when the story began. Her hair had more gray at the temples, or perhaps I had simply begun noticing it. She sat at my kitchen table with her coat still on, and looked at the same room where she had once asked me to think about what Dad stood to lose. She asked whether I was satisfied now. The question did not sound angry at first. It sounded tired. She wanted to know whether seeing Sloan lose the business, the discharge, professional trust, and now part of her freedom was finally enough. I looked at her for a long time before answering. I told her none of those punishments belonged to me. Mom's expression hardened. She said I could still pretend that if I wanted, but things would have been different if I had helped at the beginning. That old argument reached me with less force than it once had. Things might have unfolded differently if I had sold the bungalow. The revolving line might have been cured for a time and the collapse delayed. But a different timeline was not the same as responsibility for what Sloan later chose to hide and say under oath. Mom opened her mouth to respond. Dad, who had come in quietly behind her after parking the car, stopped her. For a moment I expected another argument. Instead he said, "No." Mom turned toward him. Dad did not raise his voice. He said they had all had chances to stop. He and Mom could have refused the guarantee. Sloan could have closed the second showroom earlier. She could have liquidated what she had. She could have disclosed everything once bankruptcy began. He could have called me before assuming my property would be available. The words came slowly, without eloquence. That made them believable. He did not say I had handled everything perfectly. He did not need to. He only stopped Mom from making me the final cause. For the first time, the story my family had been telling itself broke from inside. Mom looked at Dad as though he had crossed a line. Maybe he had, just not the one she thought. He had stopped protecting the idea that consequences became someone else's responsibility simply because they hurt. The conversation ended soon afterward. There was no reconciliation. Mom left still angry. Dad gave me a small nod before following her. I stood at the window and watched them walk to their car together. They were still my parents, still flawed, still married, still living with what they had chosen. I did not need them destroyed to be free of rescuing them. When Piper got home, I gave her an age-appropriate version of what had happened with Sloan. I told her Aunt Sloan had pleaded guilty because she had hidden business property during bankruptcy and had not been truthful about it. I told her there would be a real consequence, including time in federal custody. I did not give her the legal language. I did not tell her details she could not use. Piper sat beside me on the couch with one leg tucked underneath her. She listened without the expression of someone receiving good news. That relieved me. She had spent more than a year watching adults attach terrible consequences to the bungalow. It would have been easy for her to turn Sloan's punishment into proof that she had won. She did not. She said the thing that mattered was that nobody could claim the bungalow caused what happened. Aunt Sloan's choices did. The words landed where I had spent months trying to arrive. Refusing the bungalow, the bridge loan, or the lie had not created Sloan's consequences. I had simply stopped absorbing them before they reached her. We sat quietly for a while after that. Then Piper looked toward the stack of mail on the coffee table. One envelope concerned the bungalow ordinary rental maintenance. Nothing dramatic. She picked it up, turned it over once, and set it back down. Her expression changed. Not upset. Thoughtful. When I'm old enough, do I have to keep the bungalow just because everyone fought over it? I looked at my daughter. For more than a year, I had thought protecting that house meant protecting her future. Only then did I understand there was one more way I could accidentally turn it into a burden. Everyone else had tried to decide what the bungalow was worth. I had to make sure I did not become the last person who decided what it had to mean. By March 2028, the first busy weeks of spring had returned to Omaha, and with them came the annual proof that life could become ordinary again, whether a family was ready for it or not. At the garden center, customers arrived carrying measurements scribbled on envelopes, photographs of dead lawns, and impossible ambitions for shaded backyards. The greenhouse doors stayed open longer each afternoon. Trays of herbs appeared near the registers. My landscaping crews started leaving before sunrise again. Trucks loaded with edging, soil, and young trees that would look too small for the properties they were meant to fill until time did its work. For almost 2 years, so much of my attention had been organized around Sloane's collapse that I had forgotten what it felt like to finish a day without a family emergency waiting for me. Some evenings, my phone stayed face down on the kitchen counter for an hour while dinner cooled. Piper worked upstairs, and the world carried on without my intervention. Learning to trust that quiet took longer than any legal outcome. My parents had been living in their apartment long enough by then for it to stop looking temporary. The last boxes were gone. Mom had found shelves that fit the smaller kitchen. Dad had replaced the oversized recliner from the rental house with something that did not block half the living room. The ceramic bird survived the move, and now occupied a narrow bookcase near the window, apparently still valuable enough to deserve prominent placement. Their finances were tighter. The guarantee had taken a meaningful piece of the taxable savings they once assumed would remain untouched. There were expenses they discussed now instead of absorbing casually. Vacations became shorter. Purchases waited. They were not poor. They were simply living inside the resources that were actually theirs. That distinction had once sounded cruel to Mom. By then, it had become routine. The change in Dad appeared first in small things. He no longer called me automatically whenever something in the apartment needed fixing, and I began hearing about ordinary problems after he had already handled them. His relationship with Piper changed more slowly. She still chose when she wanted to see my parents. Sometimes she went with me. Sometimes she declined. I never made her refusal into punishment, and I never made acceptance into forgiveness. Dad respected that more consistently than Mom did. One Sunday afternoon, he asked whether Piper would be willing to visit for an hour. I passed the invitation along without pressure. She agreed. I stayed. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and whatever cinnamon candle Mom had been burning since Christmas. Piper sat on the couch near me, while Dad remained in the chair by the window. For the first 15 minutes, nobody mentioned the past. Mom talked about school. Piper showed them 2 photographs from an architecture project. Dad asked about driving practice, and wisely avoided offering to teach her himself. Eventually, Dad set his coffee down and gave Piper the apology he owed her without turning it into a speech. He named what he had done, calling Sloane my real family, treating adoption as something less, and being willing to use a future meant for Piper because protecting Sloane mattered more in that moment. He did not excuse it with anger or fear. I was wrong. Piper looked at him for a long moment. Her hands rested loosely in her lap. Dad did not ask whether she forgave him. That mattered too. He had spent most of his life believing authority allowed him to control the final meaning of a conversation. That afternoon, he let Piper decide what happened after his apology. She thanked him for saying it. Nothing more. The relationship did not leap back into place. It moved 1 inch. For them, 1 honest inch was enough. Mom's apology was harder. She wanted to repair things, but she still had trouble separating explanation from accountability. She admitted that calling Piper privately had been wrong. Then, almost immediately, she began explaining how frightened she had been about Dad's savings and Sloane's business. I watched Piper's expression close slightly. Mom noticed too late. She stopped. That was progress, though not the kind stories usually celebrate. She was still learning that an apology did not become stronger because the person giving it supplied reasons. Piper kept her contact with Mom limited. She answered some calls and not others. She went to occasional dinners. She did not discuss money or property with either grandparent. If Mom drifted toward Sloane's consequences, Piper changed the subject or left the conversation. I supported every one of those choices. Forgiveness had never been something I wanted Piper to perform for the comfort of adults. By then, Sloane's life looked nothing like the one she had been protecting when the story began. The showrooms and SUV were gone. The inventory she had tried to preserve was no longer under her control. The discharge had been denied, and by March she had begun serving the short federal custodial sentence imposed after her guilty plea, with supervised release and financial consequences still ahead. I did not visit her story every day. That might sound cold. It was actually one of the healthiest things I had done. For years, every difficulty Sloane faced had arrived in my life as a summons. If she was struggling, I needed to understand why. If she had a problem, I needed to identify the solution. If she made a bad decision, I needed to reduce the damage. Now she had consequences I could neither improve nor undo, so I stopped turning toward them every morning. Before she reported to serve the custodial term, she called me once. The conversation was brief. She did not apologize for everything. She did not suddenly admit that I had been right from the beginning. Sloane was still Sloane. Part of her still believed the business might have survived if I had sold the bungalow. Part of her still separated the inventory from the wrongdoing in ways that made emotional sense only to her. But she no longer asked me to fix anything. She spoke about what was coming without attaching a request. I listened, and then we hung up. That was the relationship we could manage at the time. Distance without war. My own real test arrived through something so ordinary, I almost missed it. Mom called one morning because the washing machine connection in their apartment had begun leaking behind the appliance. She had already contacted the building office, but the maintenance request had been placed farther down the schedule than she wanted. I was standing beside the potting bench at work when she explained the situation. Then she used a sentence that had governed half my life. "You're better at getting people to handle these things." The old reflex appeared instantly. Before Mom finished describing the leak, my brain had already supplied the property manager, the explanation, the warning about water damage, and the faster route through the maintenance system. This time, I let the plan stop inside my own head. I told her Dad could follow up with maintenance, and, if water was actively spreading, use the building's emergency procedure. Mom sounded disappointed. For 1 second, I felt the familiar pressure to soften the refusal by doing half the job anyway. I did not. We talked about something else and ended the call. The next evening, Dad told me the maintenance crew had come. He had called the office again, explained that the leak was worsening, and arranged access. The washing machine connection was repaired, and I laughed about it later in my car. I had spent years believing the alternative to my competence was chaos. Often, the alternative was simply somebody else making the phone call. The people I loved had never been as helpless as my rescuing allowed them to appear. Near the end of March, the tenant in Piper's bungalow moved out after accepting a job in another state. There was nothing dramatic about it. A lease ended. Dana was not involved. No family member knew before I did. The property needed the ordinary work rentals need between tenants: touch-up paint, a loose cabinet pull, and a section of yard flattened by winter. Piper came with me on Saturday. The bungalow looked almost exactly as it had before everyone began fighting over what it represented: the same small porch, 2 bedrooms, and narrow kitchen window catching afternoon light. For nearly 2 years, the house had existed in my mind as numbers and principles. $260,000 of potential proceeds. A future asset. The thing my family wanted to sacrifice. The boundary. I refused to move. Standing inside it again with a paint tray at my feet, I remembered that it was also just a house. There were scuffs near the hallway baseboard. One cabinet handle wobbled. The back door needed paint. Piper inspected the paint samples I had brought and rejected the neutral choice I preferred almost immediately. She selected a deep blue that was much bolder than anything I would normally put on a rental door. I held the sample against the wall and looked at her. "You know, future tenants can see color, right?" She dipped the brush. "Then they'll know I existed." Terrifying. She grinned and started painting. I worked on the cabinet pull while she handled the door. Within 20 minutes, she had managed to get blue paint on one wrist, the edge of her sleeve, and somehow a small streak near her ankle, despite wearing shoes. I did not ask. Some mysteries deserved protection. Sunlight moved across the floor while we worked. A radio played softly from my phone on the kitchen counter. The smell of paint mixed with the faint dusty scent of a house between occupants. There were no financial documents on the table. No one was deciding who deserved what. After a while, Piper stepped back from the door and examined her work. Then she returned to the question she had asked after Sloane's case was resolved. She said she still did not know whether she would ever want to live there. This time, I had my answer ready. She did not have to. The bungalow had never been meant to become an assignment. When I bought it in 2020, I wanted to give her options, not instructions. She might live there, keep renting it, sell it when she was older, leave Nebraska, or choose a future neither of us could imagine yet. The point was that the choice would be hers. Piper rested the paintbrush across the tray. For the first time since the family meeting almost 2 years earlier, she looked around the bungalow without the expression of someone evaluating what other people had tried to take. It was simply a place. One possible place. We finished the door and went outside to work on the front bed. I pruned one shrub, while Piper pulled old leaves from beneath the other. The soil was still cool from winter, but new growth had started at the tips of several branches. She asked me then whether I regretted selling Grandma and Grandpa's house. I kept working for a moment before answering. The easy version would have been no. The cleaner version would have been yes. Neither was true enough. I told her I regretted the part of me that opened the rental file, because I wanted my parents to feel frightened after they had frightened her. I regretted wanting the reversal itself to teach them something. That had been anger, but I did not regret ending the arrangement. By the time the house actually sold, I understood why. My parents had begun treating help as ownership. They had counted my assets while making choices I had never approved. Keeping the rental arrangement alive after I understood that would have protected the same family structure that caused the problem. Piper listened, while pulling another handful of leaves from the garden bed. I told her the part I had needed almost 2 years to understand. Protecting her had never required making my parents lose. It required refusing to make her future responsible for saving adults from decisions she had nothing to do with. A boundary doesn't hand someone a punishment, I told her. It hands their consequences back. Piper considered that for a second, then pointed at the shrub I had been pruning. "You missed one." I looked where she was pointing. She was right. Of course she was. I cut the dead branch, and she went back to the leaves. For almost 2 years, everyone in my family had tried to turn that little bungalow into something larger than itself, a bailout, a test of loyalty, proof of who counted or who had won. Now there was dirt under my fingernails, Piper beside me, and a blue door drying in the afternoon sun. The house did not need to prove anything. Piper would decide what came next. For the first time, the little house did not feel like something I had to protect from my family. It felt like what I had always meant it to be, an open door Piper could choose for herself.